Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Vigilante Deku had revival Quirk. If you guys enjoy this movie, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Finn from AO3. So let's start the video. If you want to be a hero so badly, take a swan dive off of a roof and hope for a quirk in your next life. That moment with 𝐀𝐦. That's when everything started going wrong. At least that's what Izuku thought as he grasped for something around him, for anything solid. He couldn't scream, he couldn't breathe. Not with the green sludge being shoved down his throat. Izuku wiggled around, gagging, trying to get out of the sludge that was the villain's body. But nothing was working. What did he say he wanted? A flesh suit. He clawed at everything around him. Not becoming a flesh suit today, buddy. He thought. Stop moving. You're just making this harder for yourself. A voice growled. Izuku guessed it came from the sludge because of the way it vibrated along with the words. He shivered. This has to have been one of the weirdest experiences he's had in his life so far. While he was thrashing around, his hand finally caught onto something solid. What is that? He thought, grasping it and pulling it. Oh, you little brat. The villain hissed in pain. Eyes are sensitive, you know that. Oh, it's an eye. He would have laughed at the absurdity of the situation if he wasn't currently suffocating, or would it be drowning? In the sludge of this villain. Suddenly, the green sludge around him tightened and his vision grew fuzzy. He knew he was going to pass out soon and probably die if he didn't do anything. Oh, wouldn't that be nice, to just let go? He mentally slapped himself. No, not right now. Come on, I'll figure this out. The eyes are solid, right? Well, his internal monologue was cut off by a loud voice at the end of the tunnel. Texas smash. Suddenly it was as if life came back to him. He gasped, finally being able to breathe freely, and fell to the floor. He gripped the front of his shirt, right above his heart. It felt as if he was learning how to breathe again. No need for fear, for I am here. The voice in the tunnel called again. It echoed throughout the tunnel, pulsing against his head. Izuku froze. He knew that voice. He's heard it so many times before online. He quickly turned his head. All Might. He coughed, his voice strained and dry. Thought it hurts. The #1 hero just smiled, shining in all his radiant glory. You all right, my boy? That was quite a villain. Good job on holding out so long, but I've got him now. The man held up the bottle. Izuku could see the eyes whipping around rapidly, as if looking for an escape. He coughed again. Man, this is not going to do anything good for my lungs, he thought, trying to stand up. By the way, the hero pointed towards Izuku's notebook on the floor. A page that was previously empty now had All Might in big, somewhat fancy lettering. Oh, that was his signature. I signed your book for you. You look like a fan. His grin seemed to get even bigger, if it even could. Izuku picked up his notebook, awestruck, then turned back to All Might. Thank you. He smiled softly. Well, I must be on my way. All Might turned away from the boy. Wait, he called, running up to the man. I have a question. Without giving a response, All Might leaped into the air. Izuku, stupidly, grabbed onto his pant leg and was dragged along with him. The wind blew harshly against his face as he held onto All Might and his notebook for dear life. My boy, what are you doing? Please let go. All Might shouted over the wind, his brow furrowed. I can't, he gasped, his lungs stinging. If I let go I would die. Good point. Hang on a second, let me land. And with that, All Might carefully descended onto the roof of a rather tall building. Izuku let go of his pant leg and tumbled a bit trying to regain his footing. Now, what was so important that you had to put yourself in danger? All Might turned to face him from his spot by the railing. Izuku looked down. Man, I really messed this up. I met my idol for the first time and now I'm just being a burden. He took a deep breath. Well, I've been quirkless my whole life, you see. But it has been my dream to be a hero. Do you think I could still become a hero even though I'm quirkless? He asked, his eyes watering. Hang on, that's not normal tears this time. He blinked through the sudden smoke swirling all around and looked up. Is this some kind of joke? Izuku asked faintly, blinking rapidly as if to see if this was all real. What he saw in front of him was a man, who looked more of a skeleton than a man, with grimy blonde hair and a sunken face. He could barely see his eyes from where he was standing. But he had the same clothes and hair color as All Might. So, who is this? No, my boy, this is not a joke. I'm still All Might. The man tried to do his signature smile, but it came out strained and looked like it didn't fit the proportions of his face. Izuku grimaced. Sorry. All Might put a hand behind his head, awkwardly chuckling. Well, since you've seen me in my weakened form, even from this distance Izuku could see his eye twitch, I suppose I owe you an explanation. About 5 years ago I was in a rather harsh fight with my greatest enemy. He could see the gears turning in Izuku's head. You're not going to know who it was. There wasn't any news coverage. All Might basically waved him off. He then grabbed the hem of his shirt and lifted it up, showing Izuku what looked like a gaping hole. Well, not really a hole, but close enough. There is no way he could have survived with that. he thought, mouth hanging open. That's got to do a lot of internal damage. The villain I was fighting caused this, All Might said, motioning to the injury. It damaged and destroyed many of my internal organs in the process. Now, I can only be All Might for a limited amount of time. The man coughed, blood spewing everywhere. He wiped off his lip with his wrist, but no, I don't think you can become a hero without a quirk. You've seen what happened to me and I'm All Might. It is far too dangerous for someone like you. You would just be a burden to those you are working with. All Might turned and looked back over the railing. If you really want to help people, you could be a police officer or maybe a doctor. Those would be much safer. Izuku could barely process All Might leaving through the static in his head. You would just be a burden. That's what he said. That's what they all say. He could barely register himself walking over to the railing and leaning on it. Hey, what if I just take your advice, 𝐀𝐦? I seem to only be a burden on everyone around me. He would have laughed if he wasn't feeling so numb. He set down his backpack, which he miraculously still had on, and slowly slipped off his shoes. He stepped over the railing. Izuku looked at the ground below him. Well, I guess this is goodbye. Mom, you won't have to work so hard to take care of me anymore. Hopefully I get a quirk in my next life and finally become someone useful. It was only at that moment when he realized that he was crying. The steady flow of tears dripped down his face, and with that, he took a step. The impact with the ground was quick and painless, but what came after couldn't be said the same. He couldn't tell how long it had been. It felt like an eternity and a second at the same time. It's like he could feel nothing and everything all at once. Suddenly, there was a flash of light and he could feel everything coming back to him. His heartbeat, his breathing, and everything else starting all at once. Everything hurts. Izuku slowly opened his eyes, groaning at the bright light from the sun. He pushed his upper body off of the concrete, but immediately gripped his head after he sat fully up. God, what happened? Everything is sore and I'm so dizzy, he thought. Once his head cleared, he looked around. He could see what looked like a blood stain on the sidewalk around him. It was still fairly wet. He looked at himself, not seeing any major injuries, but still seeing blood stains nonetheless. I died, I can tell that much. But then how am I still here? He opened and closed his hand a few times, itching to write this in his notebook. He quickly stood up, leaning against the wall of the building as he was feeling lightheaded. Then, grunting as he went to the side of the building to find a fire escape and climb up. If this is a used building, I don't want to bother people, he thought as he reached the roof. Once up there, he realized that the roof didn't even have a way down other than the fire escape, which he had to take creative liberties to actually get to the roof. So he left me on a roof with no other way down, he grumbled, making his way over to his backpack and notebook. After getting back down as quickly as he could, or as well as he could with how sore he was, he heard explosions from farther away. Must be a villain attack, he thought, limping his way over to the noise. Once he arrived, Izuku noticed many things. Firstly, the same green sludge villain that caught him earlier. Secondly, the person that the sludge villain was trying to take, albeit a very familiar person. And thirdly, all the heroes on the opposite side of the tape than the villain. Izuku rushed over to the tape, growing increasingly more panicked. What are you doing? Why aren't you helping him? He shrieked at the nearest hero, who happened to be Kamui Woods. We can't. Our quirks aren't suited for this situation, the Wood hero said, motioning to himself and the other heroes around him. We're waiting for backup. Izuku stopped himself before he said anything that would either get him in trouble or that he would regret later on. He turned towards the explosions, the very familiar explosions, as they increased in size. These weren't from the sludge villain. No, these were from the person he was holding captive. Izuku could see the blonde hair that belonged to his once friend Bakugo Katsuki, his face seemingly in pain and terrified. Without really thinking, Izuku ducked under the police tape and rushed over to the villain. He could hear the yelling behind him, but he ignored it, looking for anything that could help him. He spotted a lone pipe in the middle of the rubble and he snatched it, sprinting towards the villain. He lifted the pipe above his head and speared it right through the eye of the sludge. Oh, not again, the villain shrieked as Izuku grabbed onto Bakugo. When did I start calling him Bakugo? He asked himself, pulling as hard as he could on the blonde. Nope, not the time to be thinking about that. The two of them stumbled as the sludge villain seemed to realize that the kid was not there anymore. But before they could do anything, the two of them are pulled to the side and there is only one thing anyone can hear at that moment. Detroit smash. The sludge exploded and is everywhere. All Might turns to look towards the two kids. You two are fine now. He flashed his signature grin, I am here. And he takes them over to the paramedics who were behind the police tape. The doctors check them over as the heroes come up to chastise Izuku. Izuku just looks down at the ground, frowning. Bakugo doesn't say anything to him. If anything, he isn't even making eye contact. For Izuku, this is weird. He figured the blonde would cuss him out or scream at him for making him seem weak. But he didn't get any of them. Granted, he didn't get a thanks either, but he wasn't expecting one, not from Bakugo. After the paramedics are done fussing over him, Izuku finally starts to make his way home. But he ends up being stopped by the skeleton version of All Might. Izuku frowns as the man makes his way over. "You shouldn't have done that," the man says, blood dripping down his chin. The heroes had it under control. That only seemed to infuriate Izuku. They weren't doing anything. He hissed, "Bakugo would have died if I hadn't done something." All Might just sighed heavily. His brow furrowed. "My boy, you could have done more damage to your friend. He could have died because you stepped in." "Hell, you could have died." The heroes had it under control. All Might sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I said this earlier. It's too dangerous for someone like you." He looked back up at Izuku, who had his mouth gaping open, clearly offended. He crouched down, hand on the boy's shoulder as he looked him in the eyes. Then he said something that would have shattered Izuku's whole world if he hadn't already said it earlier. "You can't be a hero." "Yeah, screw that All Might," Izuku thought as he passed a street light, eyes locked to the ground and kicking a pebble around. "Maybe I'll become a hero just to spite you." He chuckled. "It's not like I have anything else to do. I can't even die." He stopped in his tracks. "Hang on. I can't die, can I? What, did I finally get a quirk after all this time?" He threw his head back and laughed. "What a joke," he said after calming down. When looking around, he saw some people on the opposing sidewalk giving him a funny look. He quickly looked away, embarrassed. He stuffed his hands in his pockets and made his way home hastily so as to not gain any more unnecessary attention. When he arrived at his house, he dug his key out of his backpack. "Good thing I didn't lose this," he mumbled, quietly slipping off his shoes as he entered the home. The lights were still off, shadows building in the corners of the living room. The only thing giving him any sort of sight was the overhead oven light that was often left on. "Guess Mom isn't home yet," he said to himself as he set his bag on the kitchen counter and he beelined directly to the fridge. He opened the fridge, the bright light contrasting the darkness of the room. He strained his eyes as he looked around. "Nothing much. I should probably go shopping soon," he thought, shoving around some old takeout containers. His searching evidently fruitless, he closed the fridge door and grabbed his bag before heading to his room. He dropped his backpack on the floor and flopped onto his bed, staring at the ceiling. "What if I did have a quirk that just brings me back from the dead?" He murmured, "Am I practically immortal? What a way to give someone with a death wish a god complex." He rolled over, looking at his desk which held his laptop that he got a few years ago for his birthday. "Well, what am I supposed to do now? I can't die and I can't become a hero." He sat up, wincing as he was still a bit sore. "But I still want to help people." He got to his feet and opened his laptop, slumping into his very uncomfortable chair. He brought up his browser and started looking for things. What to do if I can't be a pro hero but I still want to help people? What do I do if I don't have a quirk suited for heroics? Izuku scratched his head. A lot of the answers he was getting were around what All Might said earlier. Stuff like being a police officer or a doctor. Izuku knew that the police force wouldn't let someone like him join. And he doesn't have his mother's skill or enthusiasm for medical stuff. But when Izuku was finally about to log off, he found something new. "Why don't you just become a vigilante?" He froze. "A vigilante, huh? Like Crawler in Pop Step," he thought, bringing up a new tab. A vigilante is someone who uses their quirk for hero work without a pro-hero license. Many of those who fall to vigilantism are arrested. Only an odd few have actually gotten their hero licenses. Depending on the situation, some may qualify for the Vigilante Reformation program. Izuku chuckled. This could be fun, he thought. I could save people and potentially test my new quirk. He got up and searched his closet, pulling out all he needed. That included a very baggy green hoodie, some old grass-stained jeans, and a mask to cover at least some of his face. And with that, he was off. Izuku was strolling down the dark street when he heard a shrill, panicked scream. He paused, trying to determine where it came from when the person screamed again. This time, he quickly followed the sound. He stopped right before the alleyway, not wanting to stumble into something that could be dangerous. He quietly stepped up to the edge, peeking around the corner. There was a woman being cornered, her face pale and eyes wide. The man blocking her exit was large, almost abnormally so. I could probably call the police, but it looks like she doesn't have the time for that, Izuku thought, spotting what seemed to be a knife in the man's grip. So I guess that leaves me. His eyes scanned the rest of the alley, looking for something to use to his advantage. He eventually spotted a long, shiny object on the ground. A pipe, similar to the pipe he used on the sludge villain earlier, shoving down his anxiety. He darted forward. Izuku grabbed the pipe, the metal feeling slippery in his hand. Not wanting to waste any time, he scrambled up to the man and smacked him in the back of the head with the pipe. Needless to say, it didn't do too much. The man, about twice his size, turned around with a grunt. "Oh shit," Izuku mumbled as the man loomed over him. He held up the pipe as you would a baseball bat. "You wanna go?" he stammered, stumbling back as the man advanced. The man lunged, a growl escaping his throat. The knife nicked his arm as Izuku barely got away. Heaving, he took a second to catch his breath. Was that a growl? The boy wheezed, though it came out as more of a hiss as he darted away. No words, just growls. Who just growls? Izuku said, somewhat hysterical as the man lunged again, knife in direct view this time. You think you're smart, boy? The man growled, missing Izuku by a whisker. His voice was deep and gruff. I could have made bank, but you got in the way. His figure seemed to only get larger as he stepped forward, trying to limit any movement the tween could make. He swiped again with his knife, putting the whole weight of his body into it. Izuku let out a startled noise as he scrambled out of the way, his small size making it easier to duck. Yikes, he thought, watching as the man tumbled by the empty space and ran himself into the wall. Izuku spotted an opportunity and took it, getting behind the large criminal. He lined up his shot, swinging the pole as hard as he could into the back of the man's head before he could regain his balance. His strike had enough momentum to harshly push the man's head back into the brick wall of the alley, knocking him out. Izuku let out a sigh of relief, breathing heavily as the adrenaline pulsed through his veins. He stumbled back a few steps till he ran into the cool bricks of the opposing wall. He was about to pull off his mask when he heard a small whimper from the other end of the alleyway. He startled and got back into a fighting position before he noticed the woman. She had slumped down at some point and her face was soaked with tears. Her hair moved around her like water, assuming that her hair was water. Sorry about that, Izuku sighed, letting his guard down. You okay? He asked, voice suddenly moving up an octave. She nodded, wiping the tears from her face as she tried to push herself up. Weird question. Do you have any zip ties? Or rope? Or ribbon? Izuku asked, or really just anything. I don't want him to get away if he wakes up. He motioned towards the unconscious man on the ground. No, sorry, she replied, picking up her purse off the ground. Izuku realized that was probably what the criminal was after. All right, it's fine. He looked around the alley. Could you call the police or something? Let them know what happened and stuff, the teen suggested. He didn't hear or see her respond, but figured she listened based on the sound of shuffling through her bag. He spots a dirty piece of cloth nestled in a pile of trash bags and carefully picks it up. Gross, he thinks, ripping the cloth into strips and using them to tie the man's wrists together. He double-checked that he was breathing. He didn't need the trauma of having accidentally killed someone tonight. The man was breathing heavily and slowly, as if in a deep sleep, a trail of drool dripping from his mouth. He turned from the man with a grimace, watching as the woman was talking on the phone with who he assumed was the police. She looked fine overall, just shaken. While she was distracted, he managed to slip away and out of the alley, not wanting to be caught at the scene when police arrived. Izuku managed to limp his way home. He had a hand covering the cut on his arm, his whole body still sore from the day before. He really hoped that the woman would be all right. She still looked shaken when he left. He also hoped the police had taken the man into custody and had someone with more medical experience than him check over the water woman. The streets were mainly quiet and empty while he walked. It almost felt eerie. Izuku quickly looked over his shoulder, a looming fear that he was being followed. All that resided behind him was the empty street, the slight light from the street lamps giving him some reprise. He managed to make it home without much trouble, only struggling to get up the fire escape because of the deep aching through his body. He opened his window, glad he hadn't locked it when he left, and crept into his room. He stood in the middle of the room for a second, listening for any noise, hearing nothing but the sounds of the house. He figured that his mom was still at work. He pulled off the hoodie to see the damage done. There was a cut in the fabric and blood around the edges, nothing he couldn't fix. He set the hoodie on his bed, though being careful to make sure he didn't get the blood anywhere else. He then walked out of his room into the bathroom, pulling the first aid kit from under the sink. It's a good thing I use this a lot, he thought, sorting through the case to find what he needed. He pulled out some antiseptic cream and bandages and set them to the side. He grabbed a washcloth from the basin and ran through it with cold water and held it against the wound, cleaning now dry blood. Izuku winced, setting the washcloth aside. He took the antiseptic cream and spread it around the wound, hissing in pain. He took the bandage roll and wrapped it around the cut. Once he was sure it was secure, he started cleaning up the bathroom. Packing up the first aid kit, he realized he was low on his bandages. Guess I'll need to get more, he sighed, especially if this is something I'm going to continue doing. Closing the box, he stuffed it back in the space under the sink. He washed the blood from the washcloth, cringing as it still had a pink tint in it. He looked over the bathroom again, making sure nothing looked out of place, and walked to his room. Once in his room, he quickly started changing out of his vigilante clothes, as he dubbed them for now. He got into his nightwear and fell onto his bed, letting out a sigh of relief as the tension in his muscles lessened. His soft curls settled as he quickly fell asleep. Izuku awoke to the sound of his alarm. The shrill beeping from his phone gave him a headache. He groaned, rolling to the side and shutting off the alarm. He pushed himself up from his bed, feeling as if he was sinking into his mattress. He winced as he stood up, the strain on his legs almost making him fall. I didn't think I would be this sore, he thought to himself. It's probably from all the exercise. And the injury. Speaking of the injury, the cut on his arm twinged slightly. In my attempt, thinking of that, he felt a never-long chill within his body. He somehow managed to push that to the edges of his mind, but given everything else that happened, it made sense. He quickly changed into his school uniform. Even the change in clothes couldn't warm him up, walking to the bathroom before he fully buttoned up the shirt. Izuku pulled his arm out of the sleeve and checked the wound on his arm. Some blood had seeped through the bandage, so Izuku removed it and pulled out the first aid kit again. He washed the wound again, then wrapped the bandage around his arm. Yikes, I'm really low on this, he said to himself as he prodded through the kit. He put the red bag back under the sink and covered himself with his uniform shirt. He walked to the kitchen while buttoning his uniform. The kitchen was empty, as expected. His mother was at work, as usual. Even though he expected it, it still hurt that he was left alone most of the time. Looking through the pantry, he grabbed a granola bar, then grabbed his backpack and pulled on his shoes before heading out the door to walk to school. School was as normal as school goes. Well, normal for a quirkless kid, that is, or formerly quirkless. He starts his day with being pushed around by his classmates. They would shove into him, try to trip him, or take his things. Later in the day, he would be pushed against lockers, ignored by teachers, and possibly even punched before he could walk home from school. That was the average day. And why couldn't today just be average? Izuku's body still ached from the day prior. He could still feel pains and chills in his chest from his death the day before, and he was still sore from all the running he did last night. Whenever someone would ram into him or push him, he would wince. This only seemed to egg the others on, noticing he was already weak. The perfect punching bag. Then came the teasing. Teasing was normal, somewhat, but today was different. Izuku was constantly belittled from his stunt the day before. Many of his classmates claimed he was doing it for the attention, or that it was his heroic way of suicide. Some stated they wished he had died in the attack. The irony of that, Izuku had thought about those comments. The most unusual thing about the day, though, was Bakugo's silence. Sure, he made some comments here and there, but for the most part he avoided Izuku and refused to make any sort of eye contact. Izuku thought this was weird. Bakugo was normally one of the frontrunners when it came to teasing and bullying, so it was extremely out of character when he would barely say anything to him. Maybe he was just shaken from the attack, or he was having a change of heart. The former seemed the most likely. At the end of the school day, he was cornered behind the building. Tsubasa blocked the alley off with his wings, creating a shadow upon the smaller kid. Izuku was already in pain, aching from his attempt in his fight the day before, but he knew that these guys wouldn't give up their pursuit just because he was already injured. One of the two front runners, a boy with extremely sharp teeth, advanced on Izuku. His figure loomed over the tween as Izuku bumped against the cold wall behind him. Hey, you don't need to do this, you know, he stammered, internally wincing from just how he sounded. You hear this guy, Yuma? The shark-toothed boy laughed, throwing his head back to the other kid. The other kid, Yuma, cackled, his long fingers closing around themselves. He cut himself off, breathless. He thinks he can tell us what to do. He clutched his stomach, still wheezing out laughs as he looked at the shark kid. He's got nothing against us, Kenji, he replied, straightening himself out. Yuma prowled closer, eyeing Izuku like a wolf hunting a rabbit. As he and Kenji stood before him, trapping him in the depth of this alley, Yuma turned his head. You think we should teach him a lesson, Bakugo? He called out to the blonde, who was still standing behind Tsubasa. Bakugo stared for a second before averting his gaze, a deep frown on his face. Yeah, teach him a lesson. With mirrored grins of delight, Yuma and Kenji advanced, leaving a shadow of pain in their wake. The walk home was abysmal. Izuku figured that they weren't going to go easy on him, and he was correct for assuming so. After being almost beaten to a pulp, Izuku managed to limp his way back home. Izuku was surprised he was even able to walk home in the state he was in. He could already tell that he was going to have some bruised ribs as Yuma and Kenji targeted those the most. He figured they focused on that area because it was easily hidden. But that doesn't mean they shied away from his arms and legs. He tried to hide his arms away as he passed a couple walking down the sidewalk. They gave him a nasty look as he hurried by. He realized that they probably thought he was some troublemaker, given the suspicious way he was walking and the barely covered bite on his bicep. It was still bright red and irritated, blood welling up in the teeth marks. A very thoughtful gift from Kenji. The boy's sharp and shark-like teeth had managed to rip through his sleeve and deep into the flesh of his arm. But it didn't look too unusual with the state his uniform was in, rips and tears just shy of showing off his whole torso. Tears welled in his eyes as he tried to rub them away, not wanting to show any more weakness as he rushed his way home. Upon reaching the apartment, he rattled the doorknob to find it was locked. He groaned, fishing his keys out of his bag and entering the apartment. He kicked off his shoes and immediately went to his room. There was nothing out here for him, especially when he knew his mother wouldn't be home anytime soon. He threw off his bag and flopped into his bed face first. only to let out a loud hiss of pain as he landed on some of his aching ribs. He rolled onto his back slowly and looked to the ceiling, wiping the remaining tears from his eyes. Izuku figured he should at least clean up his wounds before he knocked himself out, not wanting to risk infection. He knew that would be something much harder to explain away. So, he reluctantly got himself off his bed and hobbled to the bathroom to grab the first aid kit. He grabbed the gauze wrapping from the kit and set it on the counter. He quickly grabbed the washcloth next to the sink and rinsed it before pressing it up against the bite wound. He winced, but continued to wipe off all the dried blood from his arm. Once done, he dried it off and grabbed the gauze, walking off with it to his bedroom. Izuku sat down at his desk and pulled off his shirt. Wrapping the gauze tightly around his bicep, he sighed. This was one he would have to check often. After securing the wound, he figured everything else would be fine at the moment. He focused his attention on his mess of a desk. His desk was littered with notebooks and stray papers. Some of his previous analysis for the future notebooks laid out open, post-it notes with new notes strewn through the pages and the desk. But he pushed those aside to pull out an empty notebook from a stack he had. If he was going to get stronger physically, he would have to make a plan. He knew his current strengths, mostly being his quirk analysis skills, but he would also have to target his weaknesses, being his physical state. But he wanted some notes first. His hands seemed to fly across the page as he hastily scribbled all he could remember about the man he fought the day before. From Izuku's immediate knowledge, there wasn't anything visually that he could contribute to a quirk, but the sheer size of the man could be a factor. Whether that was quirk-related or just how he was built was something that he was unsure of. It wasn't like he could just go back and ask him. Anyways, the quirk could have been something mental-based for all he knew. He didn't have any evidence to really determine a quirk, so he figured he should just take notes of the fight. He started jotting down his recap of the fight, noting specific moves either the villain or himself used for further reference. He wrote on and on about every little detail he could remember, or anything he would need to improve on. He would need to rely more on strategy if he couldn't use his quirk or physical abilities. His quirk would only be useful in very limited situations, that being if he succumbed to whatever injuries he may sustain. At the end, 3 pages were covered line to line with scrawled, barely legible notes. But it was all he needed at the moment. He would clean up and rewrite his notes another day. With a yawn, he pushed that notebook aside. That one would mainly be for his patrol brain dumps, until he could get a smaller notebook to carry with him. Grabbing another empty notebook from the stack, he titled it Villain Analysis for the Future. He knew it was something he was going to need when he was cleaning his notes. Along with that, in his future as a vigilante, he might end up looking into cases or more long-term villain hunts, tracking down leads for either a hostage, missing person, or even a crazed serial killer. Though he doubted he would need it now, but for the future. Looking at the time on his phone, the bright screen read 10:48 p.m. He stifled a yawn as he pushed himself away from the desk, letting himself get up with a wince. It was something he could continue another day. But at the moment, he needed sleep. His body still ached from school earlier that day, and whatever had affected him the day before had not subsided. He stumbled his way back to his bed, not bothering to fully change out of his clothes. He fell onto his mattress with a huff. He was out like a light as soon as his head hit the pillow. The early morning was brisk and bright, deep rays of gold shining through the clouds as Izuku jogged the streets. His breath came out heavy and loud, his throat almost stinging as little puffs appeared in front of his mouth. The few people out this early gave him side eyes or glances, but paid him no more attention than anyone else. Izuku rounded a street corner before checking his watch. 20 minutes. He slowed down before coming to a stop, hand on the wall next to him to brace himself as he gasped for air. It was the second day of his workout routine. He'd been starting with morning jogs every day as a way to build stamina. He knew he would need it in the long run. He started yesterday with a 15-minute jog, and he was going to continue adding more minutes for as long as he could. He hadn't quite figured out the rest of his workout strategy. He doesn't even have a gym membership, though he highly doubts that he would even be able to get one with his current quirk status. Saying that he does have one would be unhelpful, unless he somehow had proof he could come back from the dead. No one would believe that, but he started to figure out things on his own. Izuku has been watching some stretching and yoga-type videos to improve his flexibility, along with some martial arts videos to at least give him a grasp on hand-to-hand combat. While out on his patrols, he had been putting those to practice. A few nights before, he managed to hit a good few hits on a villain's body before knocking her in the jaw. It hadn't quite taken her out, and he still needed to find something to knock her out, but it was progress. He quite liked the feeling of working out, and how his body felt afterwards. Sure, it ached and was sore, but it was in a way that felt good. He got up from his hunched position, stretching himself out as he took some deep breaths. His throat was extremely dry and stung, leaving tears in his eyes whenever he tried to swallow. Knowing there was a convenience store nearby, Izuku pulled out his phone and started on his way there. He browsed the most recent news, which was mostly full of politics, but he found an article about a recent fight with 𝗏𝗏. It was a pretty big scene and had many casualties, but luckily no deaths were reported. Izuku grimaced. He had never been fond of 𝗏𝗏's fighting style. Looking back up, he was greeted with the large glass windows of the hole-in-the-wall store. He pushed open the door, a little bell jingling as he entered. He pocketed his phone and waved to the cashier, who paid him no mind. He went right to the back of the store and tore open a freezer, grabbing a water bottle and letting it shut. He was browsing through the shelves, looking for some kind of snack he could bring home, when he heard the jingle of the bell on the door and a thud of that same door being thrown aside and hitting shelves beside it. Izuku grabbed a candy bar he was looking at and hid behind the shelf, watching as a scaled man, looking more like an anthropomorphic iguana, made his way to the cashier. He pounded his hand on the counter to get the cashier's attention. "What do you?" The cashier looked up from her phone, a look of annoyance on her face. "Want?" She shifted in a way that her face was covered by both her hair and the scaled man. "I want you to give me all you got," he demanded, pulling an object from his pocket, his scaled tail swishing behind him. "All right," the clerk said, voice noticeably higher than it was before. "Just hang on a second." Izuku could hear the shakiness of her hands as she fumbled with the cash register. The iguana man looked even more impatient, a low hissing in his throat as he held out whatever he had in his hand. Izuku realized it was a gun. "Hurry up, woman," pushing himself into her face. He pointed the gun right at her forehead. Izuku knew he had to step in soon, or things would get really messy. He scanned the area around him. There were plenty of hard bottles in the coolers that he could see, but he didn't know how well they would work without breaking. But what he did spot was some cans of soup. He pocketed his candy bar and scurried across the floor, trying to keep quiet so as to not garner attention to himself. In the aisle over, he grabbed as many cans as he could without dropping them, the amount being 4. He tried to grab another, but it slipped out of his hand and hit the floor with a loud thud. Definitely loud enough to carry through the store. Izuku froze. The store had gone silent, the only sound being his own breathing and the electricity of the coolers. Is there someone else in here? Izuku pushed himself against the racks of food, trying to keep his breathing steady. He could hear a slight slither and scrape of the scaled tail being dragged across the floor. The hissing of the iguana man drawing closer. He braced himself. He wanted to run, but he didn't have a choice. He was being hunted. The rounded snout of the man peeked around the corner, his throat still making a guttural hissing sound. Izuku shakily raised a hand holding a can, staying as still as he could manage before he thrust it down with all his might. The villain let out a roar, clutching his snout. Izuku took the chance to dart out of the aisle and reach the counter. "Call the police," he said in a rushed whisper to the woman behind the counter. She nodded quickly, face pale, and grabbed her phone. The lizard man finally came around the corner, blood dripping from his nostrils. "You're done for, kid," he growled, raising his gun towards the two of them. But once he saw the cashier on the phone, he aimed towards her and readied his shot. "Duck," Izuku shouted, ducking as the shot was cast. The woman screeched and ducked behind the counter. There were some hushed and frantic rambles behind the counter, and Izuku hoped it was because she was on the phone. "You damn brat," he hissed, loading his gun again and aiming for Izuku. As the shot was taken, Izuku launched himself to the side, toppling over as the bullet scraped his leg. He hissed in pain, dropping his cans as he cradled his leg. It tore through his pants, but only scraped his leg. It wouldn't leave any lasting damage. He crawled back to his cans rolling on the floor, grabbing one and hiding around the corner, waiting for the scaled man to come back around. As he crept to the front of the store, readying a shot behind the counter, Izuku jumped out behind him and knocked him in the back of the head with the can. The lizard man hissed, covering his head in pain. Izuku took this chance to hit him again, now trying to weaken his hands and take the gun. With a loud crack, Izuku beat the man's hand, and he howled in pain. The gun clattered to the floor and Izuku reached down for it, grabbing it and standing back. He was huffing and out of breath, pointing the gun at the humanoid iguana as adrenaline racked through his body. "Not so tough now, huh?" Izuku huffed, eyes wide as the man turned back towards him. Blood still dripping from his nostrils and cradling his hand. The man had a wild look in his eyes, body radiating fury. He took a step forward as the doors to the store swung open. "Freeze, stay where you are." A shout came from the door as 2 sets of footsteps came from the doorway, who Izuku hoped were cops. Izuku couldn't see them that well from where he was standing, but he noticed the iguana's eyes go wide. He stammered something nonsensical and stumbled back a few steps. The cashier peeked up from over the counter, looking relieved. "This guy right here, officers," she said, her voice slightly shaky as she pointed towards the lizard man. The 2 cops advanced, now coming more into Izuku's view. He shakily lowered the gun and dropped it, the sound making a loud clattering noise. "Who else is here?" A cop looked around the corner, gun still drawn. Her partner moved to cuff the lizard guy. "Just me. Sorry, officer," Izuku said, voice small. "I was in the store when he robbed it. Here is his gun." He moved to pick it up, but the officer stopped him. "I've got it, kid." She reached down to pick it up and put it in a bag she had. "We'll need to inspect it later. Rather not get too many fingerprints on it right now." She gave him a slight smile before she turned back to her partner. "Got him locked up." The other cop nodded. "Got him, Chief 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻. We're going to need to get him patched up though. His hand looks broken in multiple places." Chief 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻 looked back at Izuku and nodded. "You're good to go, kid. We've got Ms. Ito here for questioning and I'm sure she can tell us what happened." Izuku nodded. "Thanks, ma'am." But instead of leaving, he went to the back of the store and grabbed the water and candy bar he dropped, bringing it back to the cashier. "Here," he said as he dropped the money and left without giving any time to receive his change. He drank through the whole water bottle just on the walk home. His throat had been parched throughout that whole experience. He was still shaking off the nerves he didn't realize he had. He didn't know why he had been so scared, but the adrenaline kept him going. Maybe it was because he was in his Izuku persona and not in his vigilante one. He could deal with stuff like that when he was his vigilante self. But maybe it was also because he hadn't fought someone using a gun before, meaning he and the victim were in even more danger than if the villain had just a knife. Izuku had also never handled a gun before, and he definitely didn't want to be the one shooting it. But that was all stuff to process another day. He was munching on his candy bar when he entered the apartment, quickly slipping his shoes off and heading to his room. He sat himself at his desk and looked over the papers he had scattered there. All were filled with barely legible notes and some sketched-out drawings of costume ideas and weapons. Some were drawings of villains he has fought over his time as a vigilante. Some were more doodles on heroes he has encountered. He pulled over his pages on weapon ideas, one of his main ones being some sort of collapsible or expandable bow staff, something that he could always have on him so he didn't need to use whatever he could manage to find. Possibly he could use a two-piece one, making it so he could use them as batons if needed. He felt he should also have something to tie up people with. Possibly some rope or zip ties. He wrote down some notes as he thought, going over ideas in his head. "I would need a place to get resources if this is going to work," he mumbled to himself. "But I don't have much money to buy supplies, and don't quite know how to build these kinds of things." He continued, biting the eraser of his pencil as he stopped. "I can go look around though. Maybe I'll just find what I need lying around." And that he did. He was listening to a Hero Watch podcast while he walked, stopping at the stairs down to what was supposed to be a beach. Instead it looked more of a dump. Takoba Municipal Beach, the sign beside him read. He gaped just at the look of the place. Broken appliances, scrap, furniture and trash littered the whole beach. He could barely see any of the actual sand, let alone the line where the water met the beach. This place was just what he needed. He stuffed his phone in his pocket, earbuds still lodged into his ears, and he made his way down the stairs and into the mess. When he started digging through it, he realized that he should have brought gloves, but stuff to keep in mind for another day. He pushed aside some random junk and made his way through the piles. He stopped in one spot and dug around a bit, pulling out some scrap sheets of metal and springs. These were things he could use, and there was probably more he could find if he tried. He put the springs in his pocket and stuffed the sheets under his arm and shoved his way back through the trail he dug himself. Another thing to bring next time, a bag, maybe also a garbage bag. He could probably find some really interesting stuff in here, but it's covered by junk. This would be a good spot to train, he thought to himself, going up the stairs and going back to his apartment. It'll be a good way to gain muscle if I can clean up this place. I can even tinker with some things out here. That train of thought added a little pep to his step. The things he could collect would be able to help him make his new equipment, once he figures out how to make it. Going on his nightly rounds, Izuku was perched atop a building, snacking on some granola bar he brought with him. There had only been small, petty crimes tonight, so nothing much for him to do without someone else already getting involved. He'd spent most of the night writing notes in a small pocket notebook he finally bought, mostly just quirk notes, or possibly fighting techniques and tips, things he could pass time with. Hearing the sudden screams coming from a few blocks away, Izuku leapt into action, throwing himself down the fire escape and onto the sidewalk, sprinting until he stumbled upon the crowds of people running from a street full of fire. At first he couldn't quite tell what had caused it, the people surrounding him in a frenzied panic as another large burst of fire appeared from behind the wall of flames blocking him from the main scene. He pushed his way through the crowd, moving like he was trying to walk upstream. There was a loud blast off to his side as an office building burst into flames. More screams erupted from the crowd, people now pushing each other to get by. Izuku almost fell over from the force of it all. Stabilizing himself, he looked around frantically, finally finding the source of the fire. She was an average height and had long, black hair. She looked fairly normal, but she had a wild look in her eyes, her pupils almost cat-like, and had red scales littering her body. She seemed to glow within the fire's light. Just as it seemed she was going to do something, a quick flash flew past him with an inhuman speed. Izuku almost thought he was imagining things till he saw that same flash stop. It was 𝐸𝐸, the turbo hero. He launched himself into the fight and it looked like he had it covered for now. The screams from the burning building tore his attention away from the fight. Certain spots of the building were already crumbling. It seems it wasn't very stable even before the fire. But the fire was getting worse, and most of the screaming came from inside the building rather than outside. "Everyone, get out of the way," he shouted to some people just crowding outside of the building. Rubble was still falling from some of the higher stories. "Clear out." Some people in the crowd looked at him with panic and fear in their eyes. "Are you a hero?" a lady asked 𝐬𝐻𝐸, but before he could get in a response, someone else chimed in. "There are people still stuck in there. Help them," they said with a panic to their voice. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 nodded. "Keep people back away from the building. I can't have you guys crowding the exit," he said before he sprinted through the crowd and into the burning office building. The bottom 2 floors were relatively clear, just some debris and smoke. It made sense that most of the people had been able to escape. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 soon found the staircase to the 3rd floor, and he quickly ascended the stairs. As soon as he got to the 3rd floor, he was hit with a wave of heat. He started coughing at just the severity of it. He could hear some screams and cries from the far end of the hall. Before him were some fallen supports that seemed to be the main blockade. This point they were seeming to be more of a bonfire with the way they were lit. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 grabbed a broom he found on the side and used it to shove the beams to the side, giving some room for him to cross. He kept the broom with him, just in case he needed to move more blockades, but he would get rid of it if it became a danger to himself or others. He moved closer to the cries for help, thankful that he had a mask to block out most of the smoke, but it also meant taking deep breaths was a bit harder. He spotted a group of about 5 people, all huddling together. "You guys all right over there?" he called, making his way to the group. A man with small dragonfly wings on his back turned to look at 𝐬𝐻𝐸, a relieved look on his face. "Are you a hero? We've been stuck here and no one has been able to help us," he said, motioning to a hole in the floor that 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had not noticed before. "The floor caved in while we were trying to escape. We're all too scared to cross," a lady beside him said. Okay, I'll see what I can do," 𝐬𝐻𝐸 said, looking for something to use to put across the hole. He found a somewhat stable-looking wood plank, but figured it wouldn't be soon. He grabbed it. "Here," he started, setting it across the hole. "I'll help you guys over. Just be careful taking steps," he said, reaching his hand out to grab onto and stabilize whoever came across first. The man with the dragonfly wings stepped forward, carefully crossing the makeshift bridge. "I can help you," he said, also holding his hand out. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 was grateful, as the man was much more muscular than him. "Come on," he called as people started moving forward. They managed to get 3 more people across before the ceiling started collapsing in on itself. The last remaining person on that side ended up being caught in the crossfire, the debris falling on top of them. There was a horrified scream from one of the people on his side when the ceiling fell. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 launched himself forward, pulling himself from the grasp of the dragonfly man trying to hold him back. "Stay back," he called out behind him, quickly launching himself across the now flimsy bridge and reaching to the person underneath the debris. She had short auburn hair, but it was hard to tell in the fire lighting, tears spilling from her eyes. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 tried shifting some of the wood supports on top of her, but stopped when she cried out in pain. Stop," she cried, bright eyes looking at him pleadingly. "Please, you can go on without me," she coughed. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 crouched down to look her in the eyes. "I'm not going to leave you here. You will not die like this," he replied, and started to shift some of the debris off of her. He tried to be careful about what he was moving and how it would affect the woman. As he was doing this though, the fire crept closer to them, almost singing 𝐬𝐻𝐸 pants. He panicked slightly and almost dropped some of the wood back onto the woman, but continued to give her the space she needed to crawl out. Once she got out, she was panting heavily, a clear injury on her calf. He helped her up and passed her off to the people on the other side. After making sure she had the psychical support she needed to get out of here, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 started leading the group through the fire and out of the building. There were many cries and thank yous as he exited the building with the group, but he quickly passed them off as he assessed the rest of the scene. 𝐸𝐸 was still going at it with the villain, who had some sort of fire quirk. Its exact details 𝐬𝐻𝐸 didn't know. The both of them seemed to be tiring out, which wasn't looking good. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 also noticed 2 others creeping towards the fight, and he wasn't sure if they were friend or foe. He figured foe by the way they were looking at the hero. This wasn't going to be a fair fight, 3 against 1, so 𝐬𝐻𝐸 knew he had to step in. He ran in and shouted, "𝐸𝐸, look out!" As the woman of the new pair shot a bolt of plain electricity at the turbo hero, 𝐸𝐸 managed to duck out of the way, shooting a relieved gesture 𝐬𝐻𝐸's way. The fire woman took this as a distraction to try and burn 𝐸𝐸, but 𝐬𝐻𝐸 pushed her out of the way and took the brunt of the attack himself. This is when he realized she had more of a fire-breathing quirk, maybe something akin to a dragon. But 𝐬𝐻𝐸 didn't have the time to analyze and figure it out. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 bit back a scream as it seemed the flesh was burning off of his arm. Luckily, it was only a small section, but he had blood trickling down from his mouth as he stumbled back towards 𝐸𝐸. "Kid, you all right?" he asked, trying to stabilize 𝐬𝐻𝐸. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 nodded. "I'm fine," he bit out, spitting out some of the blood filling his throat. This is a 3-2 fight. But it seems the fire breather is weak. He looked up to the hero for confirmation, receiving a nod. If we can figure out what quirk the last one has, we can possibly turn this fight around. All right, 𝐸𝐸 nodded, stepping forward. But be careful this time, kid. We wouldn't want a new hero like you to have to retire early. You've got a good run ahead of you, he said, giving Izuku a thumbs up. Izuku felt his heart flutter for a second. Someone actually believed in him, and a hero no less. Izuku nodded. All right. Anyways, you see what you can do to the fire lady. You've got the armor. And I'll tackle the lightning one over here while we figure him out, he said, pointing to the final guy. Not much of his appearance gave way to a quirk. With that, the two quickly split, making sure to stay near each other for quests, but still keeping each other space to fight. During this fight, Izuku saw 𝐸𝐸 being cornered by both the fire lady and the man with the unknown quirk, but he seemed to be sweating an inhuman amount of sweat. That was when Izuku saw him dissolve under 𝐸𝐸's head, turning himself into a puddle of water to avoid it. 𝐸𝐸, he called, ducking out of the way of a lightning strike. The turbo hero turned, avoiding some hits, and ran to Izuku's side. What is it? He asked, worry lacing his tone. I figured out a way to get rid of the fire lady, he said. If you can get the guy to use his quirk around or on the fire breather, you might be able to extinguish her flames. I'm guessing her quirk might be body heat related, but we'll never know unless we try, Izuku explained, making sure to keep an eye for the villains. 𝐸𝐸 flashed him a thumbs up, got it, and quickly returned to the fight. He continuously tried landing hits on the water guy, but he kept turning himself into water and dodging. But while this was happening, he kept leaving residue puddles everywhere. 𝐸𝐸 was also pushing him towards the fire breather, letting him reach his goal. A shifter turned into water trying to dodge a hit and ran directly into the fire lady, causing her to be soaked. You fool, she screamed, a slight hissing and steam coming from her body. Too infuriated by her colleague, she didn't notice 𝐸𝐸 landing a pretty heavy kick to her head, knocking her out cold. Izuku, still fighting the electric girl, had grabbed a metal pipe he found on the ground. At first, this may seem stupid, but he had a plan with his portable lightning rod. He kept leading her to all the water puddles, getting her into one of the big ones before weakly trying to jab her with the pole. She grabbed onto it with a wide grin, thinking she had won. But she had only fallen into his trap. As she shot electricity through her hands and into the pole, Izuku let go and let the pole drop, still in her hands. She stood, shocked for a second before realizing her mistake. As the pole dropped into the water, the electricity flowed through it. The puddle became a zapping minefield, with her in the middle of it. She screamed as the electricity flowed through her body and quickly fell unconscious. Izuku just stared. He was glad his plan worked, but he still felt bad about what he had to do to get it. He looked back to find 𝐸𝐸 standing alone over the tied-up body of the fire breather. He looked over at Izuku. You got her taken care of, he asked, taking off his helmet and greeting Izuku with a smile. Izuku just nodded. I don't have anything to tie her up with, but she should be out for a good while, he said, motioning to the woman in the puddle, the energy of the electricity still flowing through both her and the water. And I wouldn't want to touch her for a bit, he added with a grimace. He looked back at 𝐸𝐸. What happened to the water guy? He managed to get away through a drain system. 𝐸𝐸 replied with a frown. We might be able to get some information about who he is from these two, but we still don't know much. He started leading Izuku to the crowd, which Izuku realized now contained cops, paramedics, and firefighters trying to help the people and keep the fire at bay. Izuku started to get antsy, really not wanting to get caught now of all time. I'm all right, sir, he said to 𝐸𝐸, breaking from his grasp and moving away from the scene. You sure? That's a pretty nasty burn you've got there, he said with a frown, motioning to the burn on his arm. Yeah, I'm sure, he said hastily, speeding away from the crowd into the outskirts. But he was quickly stopped again, this time from someone else. The man had dirty blonde hair and freckles along his face, dragonfly wings still sprouting from his shoulder blades. I just wanted to formally thank you for helping us up there, he said, bowing to Izuku as he stared in shock. It's no biggie. Really, Izuku said, waving him off. But the man only seemed to have more. No, I insist. Here, I have something for you, he said, handing Izuku what seemed to be a business card. It read Dragonfly Industries, Agawayasu. What Izuku started before he cut him off. I own a hero equipment company, specializing in body armor and weapons. If there is anything you need, I really owe you one, he said, looking sincere. Izuku almost teared up. Thank you, he replied, looking down at the card. I'll make sure to reach out, but I really have to be going, he quickly said before running off down the street and into an alley. He climbed up a fire escape and watched the rest of the scene from away. The villains remaining seemed to have been taken away, and the paramedics were working with anyone injured. There was a rather plain-looking detective talking with 𝐸𝐸 and the lady he saved from the rubble. Next to him was someone with a feline quirk who swiveled his head to make some sort of eye contact with Izuku. Izuku startled and hastily headed home after that. After all, he had plenty of notes to take. Thank you for helping me out with these records, Aizawa. It would have taken so much longer on my own. Aizawa 𝗀𝐸 thought this was a rather boring way to spend his weekend. He had come in to do some of his own paperwork, bringing in the last criminal of his workday, when he came across the very lonely-looking Tsukachi Naomasa. And now here he sat on a chair across from said detective. He swung his legs to lounge on the desk, only grunting in response to Tsukachi's comment. We had a lot more records piling up after yesterday's events, the detective continued, brushing past 𝗀𝐸's uninterest. There was a rather large attack with some villains last night. Had a lot of casualties, as she set one of the buildings on fire. A lot more casualty and villain reports came in today, which makes sense considering the attack last night. The detective continued, brushing past 𝗀𝐸's uninterest. And on top of that, all the records we still have to sort through from the past few weeks. They seem to be piling up lately. 𝗀𝐸 raised his head, looking at Tsukachi with a questioning glint in his eyes. What happened last night? I didn't hear much commotion on my patrol last night, and I figure this was around my area. Tsukachi laughed. Oh, I forgot. It was a couple blocks away from your normal route, so you probably wouldn't have heard anything. A lady with a fire-breathing quirk was running rampage through the 𝗀𝐻𝐸 district, attacking anyone and anything that stood in her way. Someone came in and took care of her, while someone else was taking care of a burning building. Apparently they had been caught up in there and couldn't escape before someone came to save them. The detective sighed, leaning back into his chair. According to witness accounts, 2 others came in to help her, but they were mostly taken care of before the police arrived. One of the guys managed to get away, but we have people looking into it right now. 𝗀𝐸 raised an eyebrow. Who was working last night? We had Tensei out in that area last night, and he was the one who took care of the fire breather. The other one. The detective stopped, face scrunching in confusion. Actually, that was something I needed to talk to you about. 𝗀𝐸 stared, raising a brow questionably. Witnesses also account for some new hero, one I haven't heard of before. The description didn't match any of the heroes on that route last night, or any routes for that matter. Now 𝗀𝐸 was the one to look confused. Someone you didn't recognize. Did Tensei have anything to say about him? Tsukachi shook his head, looking dismayed. He didn't question it much during the time, but only recounted the strangeness after the battle was done. Apparently they mostly just helped people away from the scene, and they were the one to evacuate the burning building. The people they saved put them in a really good light, so I hope they won't be much trouble. 𝗀𝐸 sighed, sinking further into his chair. I see what you're doing, Tsukachi. He dragged his hands down his face, pulling at his eye bags. You want me to go investigate this kid, a possible vigilante, as you usually do. Tsukachi chuckled. You got me there, Aizawa. You know I trust you with these cases, especially after what you did with Crawler and 𝗵𝘃. 𝗀𝐸 groaned, spinning the chair in a circle before coming to a stop. Fine. Tsukachi grinned, like a cat who caught the bird. I'll give you all the information I have received so far, which isn't much. It seems they have only been around for the last couple weeks, based on witness reports and weirdly placed criminals. But I think he seems young, so don't go too hard on him. He finished, holding a folder out to 𝗀𝐸. The hero pushed himself up off the chair, grabbing the folder with a frustrated force. I'll have them done in no time, detective. 𝗀𝐸 could have been spending this time at home with his husband and cats, but he did have a job to do. He strayed from his normal patrol route, moving into the 𝗀𝐻𝐸 district, on the lookout for this new vigilante. He knew the normal type, some kid who wanted to play hero for reasons of their own. 𝗀𝐸 knew he had to nip it in the bud, because if this kid got way too into it, he would end up dead. Tsukachi had put 𝗀𝐸 in charge of a lot of the vigilante cases he acquired, probably because he was efficient at his job. A couple years ago, he was put in charge of the Naruhata vigilantes, Crawler, 𝗵𝘃, and ∞duster. He'd managed to finish off that case with Crawler getting his actual hero's license, going off with Captain Celebrity and taking on the new alias of Skycrawler. From what he heard, 𝗵𝘃 had gone on to become some sort of idol, keeping herself from actual crime, and ∞duster was unknown to him. After that encounter, Tsukachi had started to send him after other possible vigilantes or hero wannabes. Maybe it was because a lot of them tended to be teenagers who didn't get accepted into the hero school of their choice. They felt they didn't have another option. And 𝗀𝐸's occupation as a teacher probably made it seem he was good with kids. He would argue otherwise. Going through this line of thought, 𝗀𝐸 leapt from rooftop to rooftop, looking for any sort of disturbance. He was a few streets away from his normal patrol route, trying to get a gaze on the terrain. He hoped he would be able to get this kid back on a normal track, just so he could be back in his patrol area sooner. From the file he had received, 𝗀𝐸 got a few key details about the new vigilante. They were adorned in a baggy and tattered green hoodie, though some people recount it being black. The hood covers their head along with a mask on their face, concealing most of the prominent features to look for. Claims from eyewitnesses that have heard them speak said they had a younger-sounding voice, which had 𝐲𝐸 assuming that they were likely some disgruntled teen. He hoped he would be able to get the kid off the street soon. It was dangerous for someone that young without training to be out and roaming around in the wrong areas. It was still dangerous for teens with training. He stopped on one building, dragging his calloused hands down his face, a frustrated groan leaving his body. With how quiet it had been, he was going to be out looking all night without a sign of the kid. The only things he had come across had given him false hopes, leaving him to just petty crimes hiding around corners. But his silent prayers seemed to have been answered as he heard some noise from up ahead. Shouting, cans toppling over, all in that like. 𝐲𝐸 pushed himself off the roof, sending himself flying the next few blocks. But when he arrived at the scene, all that was left was some guy knocked unconscious and barely restrained. He jumped down into the alley when he heard the startled cry of someone else left in the dark. He turned his head, blinking owlishly at the terrified-looking man gripping onto his phone. Realizing how he must look, he forced himself to look more approachable, raising his hands for the young man's security. The man lowered the phone away from his more pointed ears. 𝐲𝐸 could hear someone on the other line calling to him with worry. He stepped forward cautiously. "I'm a pro hero," he started, pulling out his badge. "I'm not going to do you any harm." Thinking back on it, he winced at the tone of his voice, dull and gruff sounding, not very reassuring to someone in obvious shock. The man's lip trembled, seeming on the verge of tears before nodding. "All right, are you with that, the one that just helped me?" 𝐲𝐸 cocked his head to the side, frowning. "Could you describe what they looked like? I'm new to the area and don't know everyone working around in this district," he asked, crouching down before the man. The man paused for a second, eyes rapiding looking at all of 𝐲𝐸's features, before nodding. They were rather small, which is why it was surprising that he was able to take that guy down. He motioned to the man knocked out behind 𝐲𝐸. He had a dark hoodie. It had some holes in it and stuff. Oh, and a mask, I guess. I couldn't see his face that well." 𝐲𝐸 nodded, pushing himself up. "Thank you. Who?" He blanked for a second. "What was your name?" The man looked towards his phone for a second, pushing his dirty blonde hair out of his face. "Mori Akira, sir." 𝐲𝐸 nodded again. "The police will probably be here soon. Will you be good on your own?" he asked Mori, helping the man to his feet, being ready to catch him on his unsteady legs. "Why, yes, sir. Thank you." 𝐲𝐸 left the conversation and continued on his way. He was on the right track, and he knew it. The kid must have some sort of strength-based quirk to be able to take down that other guy, who seemed to be at least a few inches taller than himself. 𝐲𝐸 huffed, letting the wind blow against his face. Some cocky teenager who thought they could do no wrong, he assumed. As he continued launching himself from building to building, he was left to the quiet of his own thoughts, thinking of all the things he would much rather be doing at the moment, like being at home. 𝐴𝑧𝐻𝐸 was probably curled up on the couch with one of the cats, watching some documentary while waiting for 𝐲𝐸 to get home. He also internally worried that the kid would think he is a threat and start attacking him instead. He didn't have the energy to get into a fight with some misguided kid tonight. He stopped on the roof for a convenience store, trying to get a gauge of where he was and what was around him when he heard another commotion a few streets down. Exactly what he was looking for. Ignoring the startled cries of people below him, he launched himself up onto an apartment complex and over the roofs of like-minded buildings. He could make out the sounds of fighting, or at least punches being thrown and hitting their target. Some tumbling of footsteps echoed against the walls, like a forgotten dance. He perched on the edge of the building shadowing the alley, wanting to get a glimpse of who he was hunting for. The fighting was fast-paced but sloppy. From the looks of it, it was a grown woman with an assumed knife quirk fighting a 12-year-old. The woman lashed out wildly, trying to get any sort of hit in while the kid, his suspected vigilante, kept away from the blows by using his much smaller size. 𝐲𝐸 would have stepped in right then, but he was intrigued to see how the fight would end. He could tell the woman was losing speed and vigor, but that could potentially make her more dangerous if cornered. Analyzing the rest of the alley, he spotted a teen girl against the wall, looking for a chance to bolt. Once she noticed that the woman was only focused on the kid, she took her chance, darting from the scene entirely. The other two didn't notice her at all as she fled, and 𝐲𝐸 just let her go. No use keeping her there in the moment and ruining his surprise. Turning his focus back to the fight, he could obviously see who was in luck's favor. The kid in the hoodie ducked down and used his legs to sweep her off her feet and onto the hard ground. She let out a pained huff as she hit the floor, but made no move to actually get up. She gave up. The kid stood over her as he reached for his pocket to grab a piece of scrap. 𝐲𝐸 balked. What was this kid doing? He flipped the woman onto her stomach and pinned her hands together to tie them with the cloth strip he held. 𝐲𝐸 was almost impressed, but he noticed the knot was loose. As the kid stood up, brushing the dust off his hands, he looked around in apparent confusion as to where the girl went. In this stupor, he didn't notice the bound woman using her knife quirk to free herself from the cloth. As she pushed herself up, 𝐲𝐸 struck. He threw out his capture weapon and caught her in it, pulling it tight. Right as she realized she was caught, he jumped down and landed on top of her, knocking her out. The kid's head whipped around, bright green eyes looking startled. While he stopped, frozen as he stared at 𝐲𝐸. "You're Eraserhead," he stated with awe, seemingly trying to take in the entirety of 𝐲𝐸's appearance. 𝐲𝐸 huffed, hidden amusement and confusion lacing his thoughts. "I know my own name, kid," he started. "What are you doing out this late? Aren't you a little young to be wandering around alone?" He knew exactly why this kid was out, but if the kid panicked, he might fight. The kid froze, eyes wide as if he just realized something. I was just heading home, had some clubs to do. Yeah, got really busy at all my clubs today." The kid threw out multiple excuses, each word he said only making himself look more nervous. But 𝐲𝐸 had already caught him. Now to get this done quickly. He put his hand up to stop the upcoming ramble. "Enough. I already know why you are out here. I've been sent to put a stop to it." He sent a glare at the kid, who looked crestfallen. The squinting of his eyes is how 𝐲𝐸 knew he was on the verge of tears. Vigilantism is not something for someone as young as you. He motioned to the whole getup the kid had on. "You should be studying for your classes or hanging out with friends, or, God, literally anything else. This is too dangerous for someone inexperienced, let alone illegal." "It's not too dangerous. I've been handling myself just fine," the kid said suddenly, but seemed to immediately regret his decision. 𝐲𝐸 glowered. "Just because you're doing fine now doesn't mean you won't end up dead in the future." His thoughts flashed to a certain cloud-haired boy, a look of proud defiance on his face, but he brushed it off to give his attention to the green-eyed kid in front of him. The kid only seemed to glare in return, a look that didn't quite fit the face. "Are you done?" the kid asked with a newly added spice of snark. "Because I have places to be, like going home, where I should be." He tried to push his way past 𝐲𝐸, only to get blocked by said man. "You're not going anywhere just yet. I need to take you down to the station." He leaned over to get to eye level with the boy, searching the return glare for any source of reasoning. "You've been causing a lot of trouble and we need some sort of identification. You don't have too much attention yet, so it still looks plausible for you to get out of this with just a slap on the wrist." He tried to reach out to the vigilante, but he quickly darted out of the way. "So this is how it's going to go." 𝐲𝐸 lashed out at the kid with the remaining part of his capture weapon, but the kid somehow dodged again. 𝐲𝐸 grumbled. As he watched the kid scurry up the fire escape like a scared cat, leaping over the edge and onto the roof, 𝐲𝐸 attempted to follow, but he wouldn't get far with a body dragging along. So for once, he let the kid go. He was sure to find him again soon. "But he does have to take this to 𝐲𝐿 now," he sighed, practically dragging the woman down the street as he made his way back to the station. "So, you found him?" The hopeful voice of Detective 𝐲𝐿 perked up from behind the desk as 𝐲𝐸 entered his office. "Yup, found him all right," he said, falling into the seat across from the detective. 𝐲𝐿 gave him an expectant look, but 𝐲𝐸 shook his head. "I let him go." 𝐲𝐿 balked, which caused 𝐲𝐸 to hide a grin from behind his capture weapon. "You let him what?" He blinked a few times before narrowing his eyes at the hero, as if trying to find one small imperfection to give away he was a fraud. Luckily for 𝐲𝐸, he wouldn't find one there. "He's just a kid, an annoying one at that," he grumbled, "and I had to bring that woman here, couldn't drag her body around on a manhunt. I know I'll find him again." 𝐲𝐿 leaned back in his chair with a sigh, sounding as though he just lost years off his lifespan. All right, I trust you with that," he said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Just be careful, Aizawa. I know you tend to take in strays, and especially with your teacher position. I wouldn't want, and I'm sure Yamada wouldn't want either, to see you lose yourself over a kid you couldn't save." The detective leaned over the desk and gave 𝐲𝐸 a hard stare. 𝐲𝐸 wouldn't admit that he was right. While his husband had made jokes about it before, first being the cats they took into the students he got fond of, he knew his Ashi wouldn't want to see him hurt from it. Him and his God-forsaken savior complex. He glared at 𝐲𝐿 for a long moment before admitting defeat with a sigh, breaking eye contact. I know not to get attached." He pushed himself up from the chair as 𝐲𝐿 started to say something, cutting him off. "I should be heading back before his Ashi starts to worry. I'll keep you updated on the case," he said, waving off the man and exiting the room. Running into the kid had become an almost normal thing. 𝐲𝐸 would follow the sound of trouble and often found the kid along with it. After each confrontation, 𝐲𝐸 would try to talk the kid into coming with him to the station, but he would always refuse. He would always go on about it to his Ashi and the cats whenever he got home, and if his husband wasn't already in bed, his Ashi would always tell him to relax and not get so worked up over it. He was bound to stop eventually, but eventually was starting to take weeks, and 𝐲𝐸 was getting worried. The first cause of concern, other than the obvious, was the outfit the kid wore. Just some baggy jeans and a hoodie, no sign of any sort of bodily protection. 𝐲𝐸 brought this up to the kid once, trying not to let the concern leak into his voice. The kid, who had also not revealed a name to 𝐲𝐸, had only looked down at his outfit as if he hadn't even considered it before. "I haven't had the resources for it," he admits, making 𝗀𝗱 balk at the lack of concern for his own well-being. 𝗀𝗱 had known the kid had some sort of lack of respect for his own safety. He had seen it clearly in the way he fights. His hits were quick and reckless, leaving himself wide open for attacks against him in favor of his speed. But speed couldn't win you every fight. The kid lacked serious training, and 𝗀𝗱 didn't like the memories it brought up. He takes this to his husband and his frequently occurring vigilante events. "It's like he doesn't care whether he dies or not," he said, exasperated as he paced the living room floor. "I mean, I get being reckless because he is a kid exploring his powers, but still." ― watched from his spot on the couch, sipping his cup of tea while curled up with a living furball by the name of 𝗏𝗏. "He's probably just overconfident in his abilities," ― offered. "I mean, if I had some sort of speed or strength-based quirk I would feel pretty invincible too." 𝗀𝗱 froze, mind seeming disconnected from the body. "Ooh, shoo," ― said, snapping said man out of his stupor. "Sorry," he said, turning to his husband with a quizzical look on his face. "I just realized we don't even know exactly what his quirk is. Ssakachi and I have had our ideas, which you know, but we haven't been able to actually figure it out." He plopped down on the couch next to his husband, leaning his head against the other's shoulder. He ran his calloused fingers through 𝗏𝗏's silky fur. "Oh, shoo," ― said, planting a kiss on 𝗀𝗱's forehead. "You worry too much. I know you care, but I'm sure the little listener is perfectly fine. It's just teenage angst. He'll snap out of it eventually." He set his mug down on the coffee table beside the couch and used his now free hands to latch onto 𝗀𝗱. 𝗀𝗱 sighed, leaning into the embrace. "I sure hope so, ―. Izuku was still trying to wrap his head around the fact that Eraserhead was hunting him down. He had garnered enough attention that the police sent a pro-hero, a lesser-known one albeit, to hunt him down and get Izuku to turn himself in. The first statement he had received had put him down at first, another hero he looked up to trying to stomp down his dream. But now he took it as a game. He knew Eraserhead cared in his own way, but it was discerning nonetheless. The Erasure hero's word choice was more threatening, but it hit a lot softer than when he met All Might. He was roaming around one night when Eraserhead stopped him, as per usual. He had often sought out the vigilante and tried to get him to stop. The man should know at this point that it wasn't going to work. But one of his comments made Izuku stop and think. His costume isn't protecting anything, and it could be the death of him. Well, Izuku knew that. There wasn't much he could even do about that. He didn't have the money. Sure, he had plans to eventually get himself an actual costume. He had even been working out a design for it, but who would take a commission from a known vigilante? Plus, he didn't need to be noticeable, but he would admit that it would be nice to have an image to lean into. He did have the contact of that guy who ran a hero gear company, but he hadn't gone through the process of actually dialing up the man. He was too scared that if he contacted him, he would just send him away because he was a vigilante. Izuku knew not to get his hopes up too much. What would be the harm in asking? He sat down on the edge of his bed, holding the business card out in front of him. He had resorted to hiding in his room for the past few days, but there wasn't much to be hiding from. He knew that this could lead him to actually being caught, but he needed to take those chances to be safe. He pulled his phone from his pocket and typed in the number on the card, hesitating before pressing the call. His leg was shaking in anticipation as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then the sound of the line being picked up rang through his ears. Dragonfly Industries, Kaneko Hana speaking, how may I help you? A female voice sounded through the device. Izuku grimaced, unsure why he expected the CEO to be the one to respond. Hi, sorry to bother you. He started, trying to calm himself down, but leaving an uncomfortable pause in his wake. Okay, Kaneko added after a second. Anything else? Izuku startled. Actually, I was hoping to speak to Agawa-Hasu. I have something I need to ask of him. It took a bit for Kaneko to respond, the silence on the other end almost deafening. What business do you have with Mr. Agawa? She said sharply, almost accusatory. It's personal, Izuku said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. There was more silence. Sorry, I can come back later, he started, not wanting to keep up this awkward conversation when he was roughly cut off by Kaneko. I'll transfer the call over. He did say that he was expecting a call from someone. Izuku was about to ask who that someone was when he was put on hold. A soft music playing was almost startling from the conversation before. Izuku managed to get some deep breaths in before he heard a click from the other line and a voice came through. Hello, Agawa-Hasu speaking. The man's voice sounded slightly confused, but managed to hide it well. Hello sir, I'm the one that saved you from that fire the other day. You gave me your contact. He trailed off as he only received silence as a response. Oh, you're that one vigilante, aren't you? Izuku grimaced, waiting for the inevitable. Yes, sir. Agawa laughed, a big and booming sound through the speaker. Izuku had to pull the phone away from his ear for a second till he stopped. Man, you almost had me fooled for an actual hero. Anyways, what can I do for you? I kinda owe you one. Izuku slumped over in relief. He hadn't blown him off completely yet. I was kinda hoping I would be able to commission some hero gear from you. Like, for protection. Izuku paused. If you don't mind me being a vigilante and all. Egawa started, sitting in a contemplative silence before clicking his tongue. I can do that. First piece on the house. Izuku's whole body trembled from the anticipation and excitement. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. No problem, kid. Someone needs to be surveilling these parts of town. Now, what can I do for you first? Izuku strolled down the street, hands full of the multiple grocery bags he was carrying. He had been left some food money from his mom this morning, assumed for groceries as she didn't have the time to get them herself. One thing that Izuku could find positive about that situation is that she wasn't there to question his whereabouts during the night. He felt a notification from his phone and quickly grabbed it to hope it was from Egawa. He said he would make the order his top priority, and he should watch his phone for the all good. Looking at said phone left him disappointed, just a notification from a news website. Slipping it back into his pocket, his eyes caught something that made him stop in his tracks. It was a little shop, full of more cutesy or costume-type clothes. Izuku knew these kinds of shops were getting more popular with the amount of aspiring heroes and cosplayers, but he never had a chance to go into one himself. The thing that caught his eye, though, was a large green and gray hoodie with cat ears placed upon the hood. It was perfect. Izuku broke himself from his daze and immediately entered the building, beelining to the hoodie. He moved all his bags to one arm, almost toppling over the weight shift to feel the texture of the hoodie. The fabric on the outside was a bit rougher, probably water-resistant, while the inside had a more softer feel. He checked the price tag and grimaced. It was a bit pricey, especially with the amount he had on him at the moment, but it seemed to be one of a kind. He grabbed it and took it to the cashier. "Do you have any more of these?" he asked, placing the hoodie on the counter. The woman at the counter eyed him down, her bright pink hair blocking the view to her eyes. She popped a piece of bubblegum she had been chewing. "Only that one. And maybe one or two more I sold. I don't make many duplicates of my products. I do more custom work." Izuku nodded enthusiastically. "Okay, well, I'd like to buy this one, please." She looked at him for a second and shrugged. "Sure, that'll be 7,000 yen. He placed the currency on the counter, and once the transaction was done, he took the hoodie and quickly continued his way home. He debated putting it on now, but if he was planning to use this for his vigilante gear, he wouldn't want to be seen with it out too much. When he got to his apartment, he peeled off his shoes and set the grocery bags atop the counter. He would go through and put those away later. He had something he needed to do. He took the hoodie to his bedroom and slipped it on, looking at himself in the mirror. It looked rather big on him, but it seemed to hide his figure well enough, and with that it would be able to help him dodge attacks. Now he needed more to complete the look. He rifled through his closet, finding a new pair of cargo pants he hadn't worn much before. He also changed into his pants, looking at himself in the mirror. Though it wasn't complete yet, Izuku found himself proud of his new look. He looked almost professional. Once he got his gear from Egawa, he would be complete. He looked over at his desk, finding the makeshift bow staff he had been working on. It was partially made. He had been using some metal and springs he found on the beach to make some sort of an expandable bow staff, but it wasn't looking that great at the moment. Maybe he would have to ask someone else to make it for him, but he didn't have anyone else at the moment. He sat down at the desk, deciding to continue with this project for the moment. Izuku leapt from one rooftop to another, finally feeling free with his new costume. He caught the eye of some teens watching his go and tumbled a bit when he landed on the next roof. He rolled and just laid there for a second, breathing heavily. A bright grin grew on his face. He was having so much more fun since he got this new costume. The armor he commissioned from Egawa felt fantastic, and the chest piece wasn't constricting his breathing at all. He sat up, still trying to catch his breath. Leaning back onto his hands, he looked up into the night sky, stars littering the dark expanse. Such a shame that most were blocked by the sheer amount of light pollution the city contained. It had been a pretty quiet night. He hadn't encountered many crimes or disturbances so far, and hadn't even spotted a racerhead. That was the most surprising thing. The pro hero hasn't been around all night, and it was nearing the end of his normal shift. Once he had given himself some time to catch his breath, he pushed himself back to his feet. He was ready to continue his patrol. He clumsily leapt from building to building, trying to get a better hang of his parkour skills. He'd taken some notes on what he had analyzed from Eraserhead. He had taken to watching some of the videos he found of the man online. While that wasn't a lot, he seemed to have taken underground heroic to a new level, as Izuku could find very little on the man. He might as well just ask him some questions Eraserhead finds him, because he knows that it will happen. Eraserhead always finds him. It's almost as if he has a tracker on him. Izuku shakes himself from that train of thought. He would already be in police custody if the hero had a tracker on him. How would he even get a tracker on Izuku? Izuku doesn't let himself get close enough to the hero for that to even have a chance of happening. He drops down to the street from one of the fire escapes, being done with jumping around for the night. He strolls down the street for a while, eventually showing up on the beach. Tacoma Beach had become a sort of safe haven for the vigilante, being a spot for him to put his mind and distract himself from the nightmare that is his normal life. He had a good chunk of the beach cleared out, mostly just being the space surrounding the stairs, but it was progress nonetheless. Izuku stopped on the steps, staring out into the sea of garbage that still remained. He hoped he would be able to search for some trinkets to add to his project, but in this light he could barely discern one object from another. He sighed. He had other things he could do. Turning around, Izuku saw two guys dragging a struggling man into one of the alleys. He flailed around in the strong grasp, seeming to have someone stuffed into his mouth to muffle his shouts. Izuku ran over to the neighboring building, climbing onto some footholds he could find and made his way up to the roof. Panting, he pulled himself over the edge and crawled his way to the other side, wanting to get a good look at what was happening before jumping right in. The two men, one with long black hair pulled up into a ponytail and the other with white hair and faint amounts of feathers on his skin, pushed the other guy against the wall. Said guy hitting the brick with a groan, blonde hair falling over his face. "It's about time you stop running from up and tell us what you know," the first growled, tearing out the cloth that bound the blonde's mouth. He sputtered, gasping for air. I don't," he gasped, wheezing as the feathered guy pinned him by the arm. "I don't know what you guys are talking about. I've never heard of this group before, and I sure don't know why they want me specifically." The men chuckled, sharing a quick look with each other before gaining on the man again. "I think you know exactly why, 𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐼. Our master is interested in that quirk of yours and thinks you would be a useful asset." 𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐼 scoffs, looking seconds away from attacking the men in front of him, but thought better of it. "My quirk hardly works. He wouldn't want something faulty, would he? I know my track record isn't great as is, but it sure as hell won't be getting better with your master." The feathered man sneered, getting all up in 𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐼's face. "Well, guess you'll just have to meet him. What's the time looking, Torajiro?" He turned to the other, who was looking down at a wristwatch. "Should be any second." Unless he was at that exact moment, a void seemed to open up behind 𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐼, the feathered man pushing him through and following suit. It was a portal to a place left unknown. Izuku panicked. He had let this go on too long, trying to listen for information. He jumped down, landing atop Torajiro and startling the man. They plummeted to the ground as the portal closed. "Shit," Torajiro growled, pushing Izuku off of him. "You brat, what was that for?" Izuku pushed himself up, placing himself into a fighting position. "Where did he go? Where did that portal take him?" He shot back, voice wavering. Torajiro scoffed, brushing the dirt off himself. "Wouldn't you like to know? That's secret business, kid. None that you need to know." Izuku glared, but it didn't seem to hit the man in any way meaningful. "Why don't you just run on home, tuck yourself into that bed of yours," he said, taking a few large steps towards the vigilante, looming over him. "Actually, how much of that did you hear?" Izuku gulped. "As much as I needed to," he started boldly, but his body seemed to protest. "Who's this master you speak of, and why does he need that man's quirk?" The man sneered, lip curling. So you heard about that, huh?" He placed a rough hand on Izuku's shoulder. "Well, we can't have snitches running around, can we?" Izuku, in a moment of panic, did the first thing he could think of. He socked him in the gut. Torajiro jerked back, a pained groan escaping his lips. "You little." He made to reach for Izuku again, but he was ready this time. He ducked and used his current leverage to hit him again. It wasn't as hard this time, the first hitting its impact from the adrenaline. He looked around the alley for something that would help him. Izuku didn't fully trust his skill in hand-to-hand combat to get himself out of this fight. He spotted a somewhat sturdy-looking branch and launched himself over to it. As soon as he grabbed it, he distinctly heard the heavy footsteps of the other man in the alley. He turned around, ending up being knocked down to the ground. He instinctively held the branch out in front of him, that same branch bracing himself away from the knife the man now wields. "Not so tough now, huh?" he sneered, the knife getting caught in the branch and pushing down. Izuku could hear the splintering of his stick, and he knew it wasn't going to last long. As soon as he heard the snap, he kicked out at Torajiro's stomach, causing the man to flail, releasing his hold on the vigilante. While Izuku pushed himself up, Torajiro's arm wielding the knife slashed down at him, being just close enough to scratch him on the bicep. Izuku yelped. It wasn't deep enough to cause much damage, but it would leave a mark. He staggered back, trying to use the man's unbalance as a chance to escape. He had no other plan to get out of here. As he tried to dart to the street, the man suddenly appeared in front of him. Izuku faltered, stumbling as he came to a stop, while he heard scraping behind him and turned to look, seeing the same man finally regaining his balance. He grinned, looking at Izuku with cold fury. "Can't get away that easily, kid." Izuku turned to the new Torajiro, which was steadily walking towards him. Another one appeared at his side, then another. They were closing in on him. Izuku panicked. His breaths came out rapid and harsh, hyperventilating. He was not looking forward to this death. A sharp figure darted into one of the clones, causing it to disappear. Izuku blinked, sent into a stupor. Whatever came to hit the close disappeared as quick as it came. A new clone seemed to retake its place, only to be taken out again. Izuku looked around, finally settling on a shape atop the building. Eraserhead. The man jumped down, landing on one of the clones. The clone immediately disappeared. "They're not real," the man said in a hushed whisper. "There is only one here that will be able to actively hurt you. Our job is to find that one and take him out." Izuku nodded, breathing out a sigh of relief. Eraserhead shot out his capture weapon to one of the clones. Seeing it disappear caused him to change his focus. Izuku tried to follow suit, launching himself at some clones and coughing away the cloud of smoke they left behind. There was a yell of frustration behind him. Seems Eraserhead found the real one. Izuku turned around, finding Torajiro holding the hero in a headlock, knife pinned to his throat. "Don't move," he growled. The hero in his grip looked passive. Izuku wanted to rush forward, but the hero shot him a look to stay put. Eraserhead grabbed Torajiro's arm, the one holding the knife, and pulled the man entirely over his shoulder, slamming him into the ground. He pinned him down, holding his arm behind his back as he used his quirk on the man. All of the clones left in the alley disappeared at once. Izuku let himself have a moment of relief, a chance to calm himself from that encounter. He watched Eraserhead strip a chunk of his capture weapon and use it to tie the man's hands together. Said man kept spewing threats and curses, but all fell on deaf ears. Once he was done, the hero dusted off his hands and stood up. He fiddled with something in his ear and spoke in a hushed tone. Izuku couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but he didn't care much at the moment. He walked over to a ladder on the side of the building, the formal way to get to the rooftop, and climbed up. He carried on his way. He knew that if Eraserhead wanted to say more, he would be found. So he tried hopping from rooftop to rooftop, getting his mind off the fight in 𝗏𝗏. But the man had plagued his mind. What master were they talking about? It left Izuku's head spinned, so he stopped moving and just sat where he was. He laid back, looking up at the stars above. As if on some sort of cue, he heard the family swoosh and steps of the pro-hero walking up to him. "Hey, kid, you all right?" he asked, standing over Izuku and blocking his view of the stars. He just nodded, not breaking his straightforward line of sight. Eraserhead sighed, settling himself down beside the vigilante. "You looked a bit roughed up there. As much as I nitpick and hunt you down, I really don't want to see you hurt," the man said into the silence. Izuku finally turned his head, eyes gazing questionably at the man. What was the thing going on there? Normally there is still someone on the scene when I or the police arrive. The vigilante's eyes watered, a feeling of guilt settling over him. He knew there wasn't much he could do. It was 2-1 and he could barely take only one of them. But he could have stepped up earlier, letting 𝗏𝗏 get away. If Izuku died, he would come back. 𝗏𝗏 couldn't. Eraserhead spoke into the silence. "Kid." Izuku snapped out of whatever stupor he was in. "Oh, 2 guys cornered this other one. One guy and the one they took went into a portal when I jumped in, only able to stop that last one," he mumbled, returning to look at the night sky. The hero just hummed in response, turning his head to follow the view. "You know you can't keep this up, kid. It's way too dangerous," he said in a soft voice, the softest he had heard from the man so far. "You could have gotten yourself killed today." Izuku didn't grace that with a response. He just continued to look up. Eraserhead sighed. "Well, if you're going to keep this up, can you at least give me a name to work with? I can't just keep calling you kid." Izuku turned his head, as if in thought. He already had his vigilante name in mind, ever since he got that hoodie. Black Cat, he paused, cat for short. No one would know the true meaning behind it. He had chosen the name and overall theme in relation to his quirk. The way he was able to come back to life reminded him of a cat's 9 lives, so he ran with it. Eraserhead looked over, seeming to analyze the boy beside him before nodding. "All right, cat, I can work with that." He then quietly pushed himself up, gazing down at the vigilante. "I need to continue with my patrol or get home. Can I trust you to be able to get home safe?" Izuku pushed himself up into a sitting position. "Yeah, I'll be fine, Eraserhead." And with that the hero left. Izuku's new name seemed to spread like a wildfire. It had shown up on some papers and news articles, and some of the people he came across while on patrol called him by his name. It was kind of exhilarating. He actually felt like a real hero, rather than some faceless, nameless vigilante. But this wasn't the only thing on his mind. He had been in a brain fog ever since he saw that man in 𝗏𝗏 go through the portal, never to be seen again. Izuku had even seen 𝗏𝗏's missing notice in one of the newspapers he brought in. He had been on his way home, grabbing the mail from the apartment lobby when he found it. He almost dropped everything then and there. The paper didn't mention much of a quirk, so Izuku didn't know why the master had wanted him in particular, but he would research it. His brain constantly looped back to one man, no matter what trail his thoughts took. The master. He had no clues or anything relating to this figure, other than he was looking into people with certain quirks that would help out some sort of cause, possibly looking into people with a criminal background. Izuku wasn't sure. The last few nights he had been scouring the streets for any sort of information. He would eavesdrop on conversations that he thought were leading in that direction, but most leads ended up empty. But perhaps his constant stupor is what led him to his current predicament. He had actually brought some sort of weapon with him this time. He had finally figured out how to get the spring mechanism to work in his bow staff, making it more easily portable and accessible. He had gotten to test it out on one of the criminals he encountered earlier in the evening, but it wasn't much. He had also stitched up his hoodie, the tear from the cut he received looking fairly invisible. But while he was out on patrol, he had gotten caught up with a potential lead. He had followed two people down a couple blocks, trying his best to listen into the conversation. They had mentioned that this one doctor, one with a name he couldn't think of at the moment, was looking for some sort of recruits, looking for people with powerful quirks, but will take anyone who is willing to give themselves to the cause. It was this wording that caught Izuku on their tracks. It was similar enough to whatever the other two were talking about a week ago that Izuku thought maybe they were in league with each other. Lost in his train of thought, he was distracted enough to accidentally walk into some drug deal in the middle of the transaction. Izuku froze, staring at the two in front of him. Everyone was watching each other with wide eyes. "Hey, it's that vigilante," the women shouted, seeming to be the one dealing the drugs. "Were you trying to sell me out?" She turned on the other girl, the one buying said drugs, and "No, I would never," she shrieked, dodging out of the way as the first woman tried to strike her. "You lying bitch, you'll get what's coming to you," she screamed as the girl ran past Izuku and out of the damp alleyway. "Now what you want? Trying to stop me from making my profit?" she asked, stalking closer to the vigilante. Izuku stood his ground. "And I wonder why it's the only way you can make a profit. With your attitude I can see why no one would hire you," he snarked back. Overall he knew it was a bad idea to rile her up, but his mind wasn't fully there at the moment. The woman snarled, launching immediately into an attack. Her arms seemed to shift around her, the skin growing harder with a jagged edge, her hand mimicking more of a blade than an actual hand. Izuku dove out of the way, grabbing onto his bow staff from his new utility belt. He pressed the button on the side, the metal pieces jutting out of the sides and becoming its full length. Izuku held out the staff in a defensive position, having his hands positioned at one end of the staff and the rest used to give himself space away from the woman. They circled each other, locked gazes threatening the other to strike first. Izuku won that battle. The woman leapt, her bladed arm leading the charge. He tried to use the end, pushing her away, but the force of her larger form overpowered him. He held out his bow staff, using it as the only layer of protection from the blade. His mind flew a mile a minute, trying to find a way out of this situation. Remembering one thing from a video he studied, he twisted the metal staff to a vertical position. This seemed to have surprised the woman because she stumbled a bit. Once he knew he was in the clear, he put all of his strength and force into smashing the staff into her nose. She shrieked, letting go of the staff's other side as a sickening crack echoed through the air. Izuku gave himself a second to look. She had put her normal hand up to her nose, blood seeping through her fingers. Her glare returned with unbridled fury, and Izuku used his staff to jab into her gut as she attempted to charge again. But she was a bit more ready. Her left hand shifted back into a normal shape, using it in her blood-covered right hand to grab onto the end and pull Izuku towards her. He stumbled and she took the chance to slam her forehead into his. Izuku groaned, stumbling back a few steps and falling as she ripped the staff out of his hands. "What are you going to be able to do without this junk?" She tossed it off to the side, now looming over the vigilante, a dangerous look in her eyes as her whole face was covered in blood. Izuku whimpered. The bow staff was only a few inches away from his hand. He would be able to grab it if he really reached for it. The woman's left hand shifted again, shifting and growing until it became a metal spike. Izuku vaguely scooted to the side. She would know he was trying to escape, but there wasn't much he could even do in this scenario. His finger barely grazed the metal edge of his handmade weapon when she struck. He shrieked in pain as the spiked hand embedded itself into Izuku's abdomen. He could feel it tear through his skin and muscle, the metal making a clinking sound on the ground below him as it fully impaled him. Tears ran down his cheeks, breaths coming out in rushed huffs. He fiddled the bow staff closer to himself and grabbed it with his hand. He kicked out at the woman's knee, trying to distract her in some way. She growled slightly, leaning in even more. He pulled his other arm across his body, grabbing onto the staff. With all of the pain and adrenaline coursing through his body, he swung the metal staff into her head, an almost soul-crushing noise releasing from her mouth as she flew off of him. The spike being torn from his side caused a whole new wave of pain. He sobbed, pushing himself up to get a look at the woman. She lay limp on the ground, blood pooling around her head. He wasn't sure whether he cracked her skull or it was just her broken nose. He wasn't sure if he wanted to figure that out. Hand trying to cover the gaping hole in his side, he shrunk down his bow staff, stuffing it back into his utility belt. He had some cloth that he was going to use for tying up any criminal he came across, but he was in desperate need right now. He took the cloth and wrapped it as tightly as he could around his abdomen. But it wasn't long enough to do multiple layers. Once he had it tied, he looked around and spotted a smartphone laying on the floor. Probably the women. She had likely dropped it during their fight. He limped over and picked it up, dialing up the police department. 110, this is Detective 𝐀𝐦 speaking. What can I help you with? Izuku froze for a second, trying to figure out where he was. Block 5, street in front of the old department store. He managed to get out, his voice strained and laced with pain. While he cut off the detective, got into fight, someone here injured, drug dealer. And with that he ended the call, tossing the phone back down to the ground. He left the alley, slowly trudging his way back home. He was distantly aware of the blood still seeping from the wound. No matter how much pressure he put to cover it, his brain was mostly fogged by the pain, adrenaline being the one source to keep him going. But he knew it wouldn't last long. His staggered walking turned into a painful drag as he used buildings to support himself. His breathing came out even more heavy, raspy gasps resolving from his throat. He managed to turn around a corner and into an empty alley before he collapsed. He fell to the ground with a thump, not being able to even push himself back up. During the fall his bandage had torn, more amounts of blood waterfalling out of the open wound. Izuku sobbed, pain racking over his body as he laid in a pool of his own blood. He hoped this death wouldn't be too painful. He had gotten the call just as he left for patrol. He answered as soon as he saw the caller ID, Detective 𝐀𝐦. It seems your vigilante got into a bit of trouble, Eraserhead, the detective said, not bothering for an actual introduction. What happened now? He said, voice steady in opposition to the rapid beating of his heart. You might just want to come and see it for yourself. Xiaoda's mind went to the worst. The kid was dead. On my way, 𝐀𝐦. He ended the call as quickly as it had started. As he leapt from building to building, his mind flooded with images of a school friend, of a hero gone too soon, of the crushing rubble and the body trapped underneath. He could immediately see he had arrived on the scene based on the cop car and paramedics talking down on the street. Xiaoda jumped down, landing softly on the asphalt below. He walked over to the bland-looking detective, standing next to him to get a view of the scene. A nasty fight had taken place here. There was blood splattered all over the alley, from the brick walls to the concrete street. His eyes finally spotted the paramedics lifting a body onto a stretcher, and Xiaoda's heart leapt to his throat. He attempted to rush forward only to be stopped by 𝐀𝐦. Not your kid, Aizawa. The paramedics moved just in a way that gave space for Xiaoda to see the body. The body on the stretcher was a woman with dark hair and her hand in a weirdly shaped position. It looked more of a spike than a hand. Not his vigilante. He let out a visible sigh of relief. He called me from the phone over there, 𝐀𝐦 said, motioning to the phone lying on the ground. Said that there was a fight and someone was injured. It really seems she took a beating. The two watched as they put her on a stretcher and into the ambulance that had arrived. Her hand that was formed into a spike was covered in newly drying blood. Xiaoda took a look around the alley again, eyes stopping on a large puddle of blood with a trail leaving the alley. He knew that the blood couldn't be the woman's, so there was only one other option. Black cat. I'll be back, 𝐀𝐦, he said, following the trail with haste. It led him down a few blocks before turning into another alley. Looking in, there was no body, just a still wet pool of blood in the middle of the street. There were small footprints leading away, but even those didn't last long. Someone who had lost that much blood shouldn't have been able to get away unscathed. But the evidence told him otherwise. He could only hope that the kid made it out alive. Midoriya & Co. was a busy woman. Being a single mother with a low-paying job, trying to take care of her only son was a lot of work. She spent most of her time working at the hospital. Her job as a nurse required a lot of her attention. She hoped Izuku didn't blame her for it. She didn't get a lot of money from said job, so she wasn't able to be at home much, and when she was at home she spent that time asleep. She missed seeing Izuku. She spent her early mornings to mid-afternoon sleeping, and then went right back to work. Their schedules were never aligned. Like the sun and the moon, only living off of glimpses of each other. She tried to leave money and whatever she could for Izuku, small ways of letting him know she still cares. She's tried leaving notes around the house for him, but they always seemed to be going unnoticed. One thing she was glad for was that she had been getting less and less calls from the school. Most of the calls she received were the result of bad grades or fights Izuku had gotten into. She knew what they really were. She had heard all the aftermath of his status as someone who was quirkless. She tried her best to work with him and support him all she could. But it would never be enough. She didn't know how it felt, and they both knew it. She would never be the one ridiculed and bullied on the school grounds and eventual workplace. And it made her heart ache that it was how her little Izuku had to survive. She wished she could just take away all the pain and everything that ever hurt her son, but that wasn't how the world worked. If it was a perfect world, Izuku would have a quirk of his own, and 𝐴 would have a higher paying job, and they would be able to be around each other all the time. But it would never be like that. And no matter how much she would push herself to work harder, she would never be able to help him in the way he needs. But she would do what she could to make things even a bit better. The next few days had left Xiaoda on edge. There had been no recent sightings of Black Cat, and that left him worried. The last time 𝐲𝐸 had seen the vigilante, it had been after the fight with the clone man, and after that fight he had seemed distracted. While they were sitting on the roof before he fled, he told 𝐲𝐸 about the scene before. Apparently there was someone that got taken before the actual fight took place, and the kid felt guilt about it. 𝐲𝐸 knew there was probably some information that was being withheld, but he couldn't help but see a mirror image of his younger self laying beside him. He wasn't quite sure why the scene had disturbed the kid so much, but he was still a kid. 𝐲𝐸 had hoped to find him again, check on him and make sure he was alright, especially after that fight. But the next he heard was the fight that left a bloody mess. The woman that had been unconscious in the alley had made a sort of recovery, which led them to her statement. 𝐲𝐸 and 𝗀𝐽 sat on one side of the table while she was cuffed to the other. Well, 𝗀𝐽 sat while 𝐲𝐸 loomed as a dark presence behind him, and the questioning started. 𝗀𝐽 set down his recording device on the table and looked the woman in the eyes. "I am 𝗀𝐽 𝐬𝐬, recording the statement given by 𝗵𝐼 𝐸 and accompanied by 𝐸𝐬 𝐲𝐸." 𝗀𝐽 turned to look at the hero, receiving a nod as a signal to continue. "We are here to discuss the situation that happened a couple of days ago, revolving around you and a locally known vigilante. We are trying to figure out the truth and only the truth, with the help of my Quirk." The detective shifted the papers in his hands. They held questions and details about the scene. "Now let's get started. I'd like a step-by-step recounting of the events that took place." He motioned to 𝗵𝐼, giving her the floor. She glared at the detective before opening her mouth to speak. "I was doing absolutely nothing wrong, just walking down the street when this kid just came up and attacked me," she stated, seeming proud of herself. 𝐲𝐸 turned to look at 𝗀𝐽. "That is a lie. Please recount the factual events of the night." 𝗵𝐼's face fell, looking much more pale than before. "Fine," she cried, then went in to speak again. "I was doing my job. It's the only way I can get money to support myself, because no one else will hire me. My boss sent me out on a mission with some new drugs he wants to try out. I'm not quite sure what they do, but I was just told to sell them." She refused to meet the eyes of the two before her. "I had gotten a few out, then got to this one girl that was interested, before the actual transaction could be complete. This kid in a cat hoodie stepped in. I knew who he was. I had heard all about him. He's a common topic in my circle." 𝗀𝐽 nodded for her to continue. She took a deep breath. "I thought the girl I was selling to had sold me out, trying to get me caught. While it might not have been her, I still ended up in the same place. She ran off and all that was left was me and the vigilante. He had seen too much, so I had to take him out." She barked out a pained laugh. "I'll admit, he was good. I can tell why the others told me to watch out for him. He did seem to have some new weapon though. I hadn't been prepared for that. But I was getting desperate. He was going to rat me out and get me caught. So I stabbed him through the gut." The statement left a resounding silence through the interrogation room. 𝐲𝐸 felt sick. He looked over to the detective, receiving a nod in confirmation. "Truth. That would explain all the blood left over. But it wouldn't explain how he had been able to make it out, unless someone else came and grabbed him." His mind started reeling, only being drawn back by 𝗀𝐽 clearing his throat. "Can you tell me some more about that? Or what happened afterwards?" 𝗵𝐼 nodded. "There wasn't much of an afterwards. I'm almost certain he died, as I think I went fully through. But he wanted to have the last laugh, I guess. He swung his pole at me and knocked me in the head. Don't remember anything after that." 𝗀𝐽 dipped his head. "That will be all, thank you 𝗵𝐼." He stopped the recording and stood up. 𝐲𝐸 took a step back. "The other officers and I will review the recording and then we will decide your sentence. Good day, Ms. 𝗵𝐼." He pushed his chair away and walked to the door, motioning for 𝐲𝐸 to follow him. And the hero did so. Once they had escaped the vision and peering eyes of the other officers, 𝐲𝐸 could feel himself start to break. He slumped down in the chair in 𝗀𝐽's office, the detective taking his side before him. It was all true, wasn't it? He looked up to the man, his face dark. 𝗀𝐽 nodded, looking grim. "I'm afraid so, 𝐸𝐬." He knew the dangers the job could come with. "There isn't much we could have been able to do about it." 𝐲𝐸 forced himself up, pacing around the small space of the office. "He's just a kid, 𝗀𝐽. I could have done so much more to stop him from going out there. I could have he cut himself off, trying to calm his beating heart. The blood trail led to a dead end, 𝗀𝐽. Nothing was there other than a pool of blood similar to the one in the other alley. So either he is somehow still alive, possibly he or someone else he knows has a healing quirk, or someone else took him." 𝗀𝐽 looked up, brow furrowed in confusion. "I know he's a known vigilante, but who would be after him?" 𝗲𝐸's face grew dark. "I don't know, detective. I really don't know." 𝗲𝐸 had spent most of the day moping on the couch and his ashy didn't know what to do about it. He had just gotten back from one of his patrols, as he was still in half of his present Mike costume, when he saw 𝗲𝐸 laying face down on the couch. "Ooh, shoo," he called carefully, trying to unlace his boots. A muffled response came from the direction of his husband and his ashy took that as an all clear to continue. "What's going on? Normally you're either asleep or doing some work at this time." He slipped off his coat and walked over to the back of the couch, leaning over and seeing the long mess of black hair. Another incomprehensive response came from the man and 𝐻𝐻𝐸 sighed. "Shoo, come on, get up," he huffed as he rolled the man around to his back, 𝗟𝐸 barely resisting. "Talk to me." 𝗟𝐸's red eyes looked tired. Well, more tired than they normally would. He ran his calloused hands down his face, as if trying to drag the skin off. "𝗀𝐾𝐭 and I just got an update on our vigilante case," he started. 𝐻𝐻𝐸 perked up. "Oh, Black Cat. I hope the little listener is doing okay." Once he spotted the grim look on his husband's face, he knew otherwise. "What happened?" "There was a fight the other day involving him. I think I told you about that one." 𝐻𝐻𝐸 took a second to think. "The one with that unconscious woman in the blood trial, right?" 𝗟𝐸 nodded. "𝗀𝐾𝐭 and I got her statement today and, oh God. 𝐻𝐻𝐸, it was awful. The way she talked about it, like someone just talking about the weather." 𝐻𝐻𝐸 moved himself around the couch, moving 𝗟𝐸 so he could sit next to him. He wrapped his arm around the other's waist. "Oh, shoo. What did she say?" 𝗟𝐸 leaned against his shoulder, drawing in a deep breath to recover any sense he still had. "She stabbed him, 𝐻𝐻𝐸. Like, full-on impalement through the gut. The amount of blood left over was awful." He took another shaky breath. "I don't know if he made it. I haven't seen him around, and I feel it's my fault if he's dead. I should have done more." 𝐻𝐻𝐸 drew him in closer, planting a kiss on his forehead. "No, 𝗟𝐸, it's not your fault. He could be healing himself right now. You said that there was no body there, right? Maybe he's got some sort of healing quirk and he's all fine. If he were dead, we would have missing posters to go off of, especially for someone that young." 𝗟𝐸 nodded, looking weary. "You're right, 𝐻𝐻𝐸. He's fine. I shouldn't get myself too attached," he mumbled, passing out onto the blonde's shoulder. As cute as it was, 𝐻𝐻𝐸 was now stuck with the thoughts that troubled him. ⴘⴇ finally had a couple days off. She spent most of the afternoon hanging out with Mitsuki, as it had been a while since she had been able to hang out with her best friend. They talked over lunch, just catching up on the last few weeks, or months. It had been a while. "How's little Zuzu been?" Mitsuki asked, finger trailing around the rim of her glass. "Oh, good, I hope. I haven't had much of a chance to talk with him recently. We've both just been so busy." "Is Katsuki still planning to try out for that hero school?" Mitsuki laughed, the sound barking and sharp. "Is he? It's all he will talk about. A couple weeks ago he mentioned that Izuku wanted to try out. Do you know if he's still doing that?" ― shook her head, a sheepish look on her face. "Last I heard he wanted to, but he hasn't brought it up as much when I'm around. Maybe he dropped it. It would be safer for him. I really don't want him getting hurt." "Izuku, just dropping heroics. He's been obsessed since he was born, ―. I doubt he would have just dropped it." Mitsuki reasoned, face looking confused. "I don't know, Mitsuki," she started. "Maybe he's found something better. Safer, you know. I'm sure you worry about Katsuki all the time." The blonde chuckled, ducking her head. "Got me there. Always worried he's gonna do something stupid and get himself killed. I can only hope I taught him well enough to use his head." ― giggled, taking a sip of her drink. "I'll talk to him about it tomorrow. I plan to try and spend some time with him before and after school. It's been a while since we had a good chat." Mitsuki shot her a grin. "There you go. Anyways, it's been a good time. Hopefully I'll see you again soon." ― nodded enthusiastically. Always Mitsuki. Getting home at a normal time wasn't ordinary for ―. She would usually get home around midnight or later and just crash. But it was roughly 10 p.m. and she was bringing home some leftover Chinese food for both her and Izuku. She didn't expect him to be awake, knowing it was a school night, so she didn't bother going in to check on him for a while. After she had gotten herself ready for bed, she walked over to the All Might-themed door and slowly pushed it open. The room was mostly dark, other than the table lamp at the bedside. It illuminated both the bed and the window. Izuku's bed, which should have been holding said boy, was empty. ― thought of all the different reasons as to why he could be gone. Maybe he was hanging out with a friend. She hadn't heard anything from Mitsuki, so he might not be with Katsuki. But sometimes they would disappear together. Or maybe he was out with some new friends. Oh, that would be wonderful. Leaving her worries on that note, she closed the door and moved herself to her own room. She slipped under the covers and quickly fell asleep. A soft smile adorned on her face. This time, when waking up in the morning, he expected the pain. He peeled himself from his All Might-themed bed sheets and stretched, popping his back and wringing his body of any kinks and sores. Izuku's hands shook like he had chills. But he knew that wasn't the case. In opposition, he felt sweaty and hot. That didn't stop the coldness collecting in his chest. But he figured it might just be a byproduct of his quirk. Pushing himself from his bed, he caught a glance of himself in the mirror. His hoodie was torn, but luckily not too damaged. The same could not be said for his shirt. There was blood staining the area around the wound. The cloth trying to suppress it didn't do too much. He unwrapped the binding and stripped himself of his shirt, trying to get a good look at the wound. While it was only a few hours after the event, the wound looked as if it had been closed and healed. The only mark remaining other than some dried blood was a large scar. Sure, there was a soreness in the area, but that was all he could really feel. Checking out the rest of his body, he also noticed that some of the other cuts he had gained over the past few days were healed up too. It was impressive, considering that he had been impaled just the night before, and now he had to get ready for school. Izuku was almost glad he died, as this was much easier than having to hide a gaping hole in his abdomen from the rest of the student body. If the wound didn't kill him, his bullies sure will. He resolved to put on his 𝐴lder uniform, still working on stretching himself out as part of his morning routine. After grabbing his backpack and stuffing it with all his notebooks that were strewn around his room, he opened the door only to hear some noise from the kitchen. He stopped. He was supposed to be home alone right now, or his mother is normally asleep at this time if anything, and he knew that almost nothing would wake his mother. He crept his way along the hallway, trying his best to keep himself quiet. Turning the corner, he saw a short woman with green hair very similar to his own. "Mom?" he asked, voice filled with confusion. "Oh, Izuku." She turned, startled. "I didn't hear you come in." "Go on, sit down. I've got breakfast almost ready." He waved him to the table set for two. Izuku blinked. "What are you doing here?" "I mean," he flailed, "not that I don't want to see you, just you're normally not here this early." 𝐴lko smiled. Turning off the stove, she had something sizzling on. "I have a couple days off, so I figured I'll spend some time with you today." She put some bacon on plates she had already sitting out, each occupying 2 fried eggs each. It was more effort than anything Izuku had done for himself. He could feel his eyes get heavy as he took a seat at the table. His mom set the plate on the placemat before him and took the seat across the table. "It's really good to see you, Izuku. It's been so long since we have been able to talk face to face." She laughed, a small sound. The smile on her face looked sad. Izuku averted his eyes, slowly getting into his meal. He tried his best to push down any resentment he had for the woman, only leaving himself to feel guilty that he had those feelings in the first place. "So, did you get a promotion? Or just some days off?" "Just some days off, dear. I'm trying my best to get that promotion. It's almost like they don't want me to have it." She chuckled. "Anyways, how has school been?" Through the food in his mouth, he replied, "It's been fine. Nothing much going on other than applying to high schools." He wasn't going to tell his mother that he had barely been at school for the past few weeks, so what she didn't know wouldn't hurt her. "Oh, how has that been going? Are you still applying to UA?" Izuku grimaced. "Oh, no, I dropped that one. I don't want to be a hero anymore, Mom." Even just the admission hurt. It wasn't entirely true. He didn't have a chance of becoming an actual pro hero while he was known as a vigilante. His mother's face fell. "Oh, do you have a different path in mind?" He could hear her voice wavering, and he wanted this conversation to end. "Yeah, I don't know exactly yet, but I want to be able to be successful. I know I wouldn't last in heroics." 𝐴lko gave him a watery smile. "Anyways, I plan to stop by the store later today. Is there anything specific you want me to grab?" Izuku shook his head, finishing up the food off his plate. "No, thank you, Mom." He pushed himself from his chair and brought his plate over to the kitchen sink. "Oh, I did have something I wanted to ask you." 𝐴lko started slowly. "I was checking up on you last night and I didn't see you in your room." He froze. She had caught on. He started to stumble out a response, but she cut him off. "Did you make a new friend? If you were hanging out at their house, you can just say, 'I'd just like a heads up next time.'" She smiled softly as Izuku turned around. "Yeah, I've made a new friend and I've been hanging out with them a lot recently. They've been helping me with a school project and stuff. Well, I can't wait to meet them." She stood up with her own plate, only half the food still left on it, and followed Izuku to the kitchen. "Now have a good day at school, dear." She had to reach up a bit to plant a kiss on his forehead, giving that as his sign to leave. He made a new friend. Izuku isn't sure why he had agreed to that. The only 2 new people he had met are the pro hero Eraserhead and the CEO of Dragonfly Industries. They were not people he could bring home to meet his mother. But he didn't want to worry his mother, so maybe he had to make a friend just for her sake. Izuku didn't think of himself as a likable person, especially now that he went and beat people up every night, and no one at school would talk to him without ridicule, so that crossed another slot. He wasn't quite sure where he would actually find someone. He had been strolling down the streets, leaving school early in order to hang at the park instead. He pulled out one of his quirk analysis books and started jotting down some notes he had made in his pocket notebook. He had been taking notes of different quirks he came across and wanted to know more about them. He was still trying to figure out the quirk of the Akari guy. The only thing he had seen of the man was an incredibly small ad in a newspaper saying that he was missing and looking for any sort of information. Izuku had no information to give. He would spend the next few nights searching, but with his mom home he was worried she would find out he was sneaking out at night and not going to his supposed friend's house, so he had to stay on the down low. He hoped Eraserhead wouldn't mind, but he figured the man wouldn't care much either way. Maybe he would think Izuku quit for good. He thinks the man would like that. The first night Izuku was back on his patrols, he had a lot of things he needed to do. First, he needed to get himself warmed up. He had spent the last few days not doing his regular nightly workouts and recovering from his soreness and bruises, so he had to get his body readjusted. Second, he needed to get a look at the crime and stuff the past few days. He hoped it didn't spike up because he was gone. He would also look into new leads on the Master or 𝐻𝐻𝐸. Third, find Eraserhead. Apologize for being gone for a bit. He liked to think the man was worried, but he didn't dwell too much on it. And finally, he needed to make a friend. He hoped he could just find someone out on the streets and try and make friends with them, but that was a long shot. No random person would want to be friends with some kid that dropped in from the sky. He shot himself up a fire escape staircase, perching atop the building. He dangled his feet over the ledge when he saw a shadow in his peripheral. He turned and squinted against the darkness of the night. It was a vaguely familiar shape, one he expected to see tonight. One thing to check off his patrolling bucket list. Looking at the form of the pro hero, he waved, making sure the gesture was big and noticeable. Eraserhead, in all his glory, stumbled as he started to race over to the Vigilante. Izuku's eyes widened, fearing that the man was going to attack him instead of welcoming him with open arms. He forced himself up, stepping back a few steps as the hero reached his destination. Eraserhead grabbed his shoulders and used Izuku's stupor to analyze every fiber of his being. "Ooh, sir." Izuku pried the man's hands from his bicep, looking with vague concern. His eyes met the glaring red of the hero, but instead of anger, there was a look of relief. "What's going on with you?" Izuku took a few more steps back, almost reaching the edge of the rooftop. He was almost convinced that this was an imposter in the hero's body. The hero took a step back, composing himself. "Black Cat, it's good to see you." Izuku gave him a look of confusion. "Oh, yeah, good to see you too, Eraserhead." He tried to calm himself, but his mind always kept his escape routes in check. "What was that all about? Thought you were gonna kill me or something." He chuckled, trying to get a good look of the hero himself. Eraserhead shook his head. "It's nothing, sorry about that. We just haven't seen you in a couple days, since that fight a couple days back. Detective Tsukachi got the call, but you weren't to be found." He took a seat at the ledge Izuku was just at, patting the spot next to him. "You had us worried, kid. We thought you were dead." "Oh," Izuku started, hesitantly taking a seat next to the hero. "Sorry." He ducked his head, not meeting Eraserhead's gaze. He couldn't really tell the man that he had in fact died, but came back to life. That's not something you just tell someone who is worried about you. The fact that the pro-hero Eraserhead was worried about him is what surprised him the most in this situation. "No need to be sorry, kid. I just wish you would be more careful with yourself. It's okay to ask for help." Izuku finally turned to meet his eyes, a silent plea going between them. Yeah, okay. I'll keep that in mind, sir." He pushed himself up from the ledge, dusting off his pants. "I really don't mean to worry you, Eraserhead, and I'm sorry for doing so." He quickly bowed, rushing off before the hero could get another word in. He hoped the next time they met it would be a more pleasant conversation. The day had slipped away from him. Izuku had spent most of his weekend working away at the piles of garbage on the beach, and he hadn't realized that the sun was already setting. He brushed the sweat from his brow and took a step back. There was getting to be a clear path to the water at this point, and Izuku was still just starting. If he came back tomorrow, he would most likely have that path cleared out. He started packing up his things, only being distracted by the rumbling of his stomach and his sudden lightheadedness. He hadn't eaten much today and it was starting to show. Izuku quickly made his way back home, trying not to pass out, slipping off his shoes as he entered the house. He beelined to the kitchen, grabbing some leftover katsudon that his mom made him the other night when she was here. He put some in the microwave to heat it up, then leaned on the counter to look at some recent news. He had mostly been looking for the overall crime rate, but that wasn't something you could just find on the front page, so he searched for missing persons reports instead. There had been no updates on Akari's case, but Izuku was looking for cases that could possibly be similar. He had been lost. There was nothing he could find that could lead him to helping the man, or getting him back. Hell, he still didn't know what kind of quirk he had that the master had supposedly wanted so much. Maybe he should ask Eraserhead about the clone guy next time they meet. Maybe he'll have some sort of testimony that was given. The microwave dinged and Izuku quickly pulled out his food. He scarfed down as much as he could before turning to his room and changing into his vigilante gear. He had things to do tonight. While he might have said he had things to do, he really had nothing. The streets have been quiet and it's like Izuku wasn't there at all. There was no one for him to help. He spent a lot of his night just loitering on some roof and working on some classwork. He wasn't even sure he was going to turn it in, but he liked learning anyway. He had been finishing some of his math work when he heard a scuffle from a few streets away. Izuku shot into action. He packed his work back into his backpack and made his way to the scene. Dropping his bag, he looked down onto the street. He shielded his ears as he was bombarded with a cacophony of sound. It was sharp and loud, like some sort of super-powered shriek. Once the noise died down, Izuku looked down again. Some shorter woman with long white hair had cornered a very particular-looking teen. His hair was a messy patch of purple, a predominantly tired look in his eyes. Hell, his eyes looked like they could rival Eraserhead's. Izuku thought they could be related if he didn't know any better. He shook his head. He was getting distracted. The woman marched a few steps closer, the purple-haired teen cowering, shielding his ears. It looked as if she was charging another attack. This was his time to strike. Izuku leaped down from the roof, landing a few feet away from the woman. She quickly turned around, her attack now fully charged. She shrieked again, the wall of noise pushing Izuku back a few feet. After she was done, Izuku launched forward, using his momentum to shove her to the floor. She fell with a huff, a scowl on her face as he loomed over her. The purple-haired kid stepped forward, putting a hand out to get Izuku to pause. "Hang on a sec," he said, his voice low. Izuku stared while the teen said something to the woman. "Not all powerful as you like to think, huh?" Snark laced his tone, face growing into a grin. It was almost impossible to see this as the same guy who was cowering just seconds before. "I'll show you," she snapped, suddenly stopping mid-sentence. Her eyes fell blank. "What happened to her?" Izuku asked, gaze still locked on the teen in curiosity. It's my quirk. Sorry, I figured you'd like some help. But I'm sure you had it covered." He scratched at the back of his neck. "Anyways, step back for a second." Izuku heeded his warning, trying to figure out this guy. He turned his focus back to the frozen woman on the ground. "Get up and keep your hands pinned behind your back." Izuku watched in astonishment as the woman did just that. "Wow, this makes my job a lot easier." He flashes a grin towards the other kid, but quickly realizes that he couldn't see it with his mask on. He fished out some zip ties he had found at the beach, using them to bind the woman's arms together. But it seemed the movement of him jostling her arms caused her to snap out of it. She startled, surprised to find herself bound. She glared at the two of them. "You know I can still use my quirk, right? Nothing is stopping me right now." Izuku turned as the purple-haired teen stepped forward, somehow gaining a cloth in his hand. "Thank you for reminding us, we greatly appreciate it." He used the cloth to gag her, binding her mouth shut. She flopped down in defeat. The human embodiment of insomnia turned around, facing Izuku with a sheepish grin. Thanks for helping me out there. I wasn't quite sure what to do." The vigilante shook his head, putting his hands up to push away the thanks. "No, thank you. Your quirk really helped me out there. With the criminals I've been fighting, it was a breath of fresh air." He laughed. The teen just looked at him owlishly. "How many people do you fight on a daily basis?" Izuku shrugged. "It really depends on the day. On days like today, this was my only case in my entire patrol. Some days it can be fight after fight after fight." The purple-haired kid grinned again. "Has anyone ever told you just how cool you are?" He held out a hand to the vigilante. "I'm Shinsu, at your service. Or just as a friend, I could use some friends." Just as Shinsu started to take his hand back awkwardly, Izuku took his hand, matching the grin. "Black cat, I think I could use a friend too." Once the police had come to retrieve Shinsu's statement and the woman they had bound, the two walked down to the park to hang out a bit. "Sue, what caused you to start this whole vigilante business?" Shinsu asked, hands resting in his pockets as they walked side by side. Izuku fidgeted with his hands. "It's a rather long story. Harsh words from one person, dreams crushed from another. Same old, same old." The taller teen looked at him with a raised brow, but decided to not question it. "Fair enough. I mean, you seem to be doing well at it." He stopped, still as if frozen in the moment. Izuku stumbled, not expecting the sudden stop. Shinsu, what happened?" A large grin grew along the other's face, looking almost devious. "You are basically a hero, right? You've got a bunch of fighting experience and stuff." Shinsu started, regaining his pace with Izuku. "I'm planning to apply for you, but I have no experience with physical combat. I only rely on my quirk." He ended, looking sheepish. He hadn't quite explained what his quirk was, but Izuku was determined to figure it out. He was intrigued. "I can try and train you. I'm not sure how much help I'll be, but I can be a stepping stool of sorts," Izuku offered, enjoying the way the others' faces seemed to brighten. "I can probably also get some insider info," he added, leaping to stand on a bench they were walking past. "I know a pro hero that works as a teacher there." Shinsu's eyes widened. "Really?" The monotonous tone in his voice made it hard for Izuku to tell if he was being sarcastic or not. But he continued anyway. "Yeah, some days I spend a good chunk of my patrols with this underground hero. He goes by the name Eraserhead." Shinsu stopped a second time that night, mouth agape and eyes wide. "You've got to be fucking with me," he said after some time. Izuku blinked. No, I don't think I am." Shinsu marched up to him, stars in his eyes as he grabbed the edges of Izuku's hoodie, bringing them eye to eye. "You've got to get me his autograph. Cat, I will literally get on my hands and knees begging. He is my idol." Izuku laughed nervously, heart racing. He wasn't used to being this close to someone physically, well, in a way that wasn't violent. "I'll ask him next time I see him. Maybe I'll get a chance to introduce you too." Shinsu looked so giddy that Izuku was afraid he may explode, figuratively of course. If you can do that, cat, I will quite literally die for you. Izuku went home that night feeling giddy. He had actually made a friend, despite all odds. They swapped numbers at the end of the night when they split up, so they could stay in contact. And now he just has to find Eraserhead and ask him for some help with the UA entrance exam. When Izuku woke the next morning, that ecstasy hadn't worn off fully. When going out to get food, he was surprised to see his mom in the kitchen again. She turned as he entered the kitchen, leaning against the counters. "Oh, good morning, Izuku. You look rather happy this morning," she commented, a raised eyebrow with a smirk. "I was hanging out with my friend last night," he said, trying to bite back a smile. "He plans to apply for UA, and I'm going to help him research for the entrance exam." Ꞡ𝐻 turned off the stove and reached in to give Izuku a hug. "Oh, Izuku, I'm so glad you have been able to find friends. What's their name? How did you two meet? When will I be able to meet them?" Izuku laughed, playfully pushing away from his mother. "His name's Shinsu. I met him while I was out studying at the park and we just clicked, I guess." He paused for a second. He couldn't really bring Shinsu over at the moment because he was trying to keep his civilian identity on the down low. "It might be a while till you can meet him. His parents are a bit strict and want him to do well in school." "That's all fine. Now get some food before it goes cold," Ʞ𝐻 said, planting a kiss on his cheek as he went to get himself some breakfast. Izuku walked the streets with a skip in his step, still riding the high that was meeting Shinsu. He was especially excited to tell Eraserhead about him. He also needed to ask the hero about how exams would go. It had taken him a while to find the pro hero. He was not as great at finding as said man, and he waved him down. "Eraserhead," he called, watching as the hero stopped in his trail, looking around wildly till his eyes landed on the Vigilante. "Black Cat, what do you want?" He perched on the edge looking down at Izuku, his hair and the shadows blocking the expression on his face. "I've got some questions for you," he called back up. Looking around the side of the building, he saw some things he could use to climb to the top. "Hang on, I'll be up in a second." He dashed to the side as Eraserhead made some sort of response. He leapt on top of a dumpster and launched himself into the air. He latched onto a small balcony outside of someone's windows and used it to pull himself up. He huffed at the amount of exertion he was putting his body through, but suddenly something grabbed him around the middle and he was being lifted up. He sat stunned as he was floating in the air. Then he looked to see that Eraserhead's capture weapon had caught him and said hero was pulling himself up. Izuku looked sheepishly at the man as he set him down and released his weapon. Izuku stood up and brushed himself off. "Anyways, I had a few things I wanted to talk to you about, if you are free." Eraserhead sighed, but Izuku could see the fond smile on the man's face. "If you insist, kid. I don't have much going on." The two, Vigilante and hero side by side, sat on the ledge looking over the streets as Izuku recounted his experience from the day before. "So, I leapt down to save this kid, because he was in trouble. Then the lady turned and used her quirk on me instead. And after that, the kid used his quirk on her instead. It seemed to be some sort of mind control type thing. It was really cool actually, but he didn't give me much info on it. But after we had her detained and the cops took her away, me and him just took a stroll through the park." Izuku rambled away, hands unconsciously being used to further any point he made. Eraserhead gave him a small smile as he watched the kid in silence. "So, I made a new friend last night, which was a surprise for me because no one usually wants to be my friend. My mom was also really excited. She doesn't get to hear me talk about my friends that often." Eraserhead nodded. "That's great, kid, I'm proud of you." Izuku shot him a bright smile at the praise. "Also, had something I needed to ask of you. You're a teacher at UA, right?" Eraserhead quirked an eyebrow. "I am. What about that do you need info on?" "Oh, I was wondering if you had some insider info on how the entrance exam would work." The hero looked at him in surprise. "Well, the hero exam tends to change each year, and I'm not allowed to give the test beforehand. But I do know that it favors those with more physical quirks, or more highly powered ones." Izuku nodded for him to continue, trying to latch on to any information he could get. "I didn't get in on my first time. I was actually put into the general education class first. I used the sports festival to get myself switched into the hero course. Whoa, I didn't know they could do that." Izuku's mind raced as he thought of possible scenarios and what would best help Shinsu. "Thank you, Eraserhead, sir. I really appreciate it." "No problem, kid," Eraserhead added, his eyes holding a look that Izuku couldn't quite discern. "And feel free to call me Aizawa, or 𝐻𝐿 if you are really feeling it. If you need any training help, you can always reach out. I'll teach you all you need to know." Bakugo Katsuki was an asshole, and he knew it. Ever since he had been caught in that sludge villain attack, he had taken the time to reconsider his actions. It had changed him, in a way, one he wasn't quite sure how he felt about. He became almost paranoid. He refused to spend too much time alone when out in public. But when at home he would shut himself away into his room for hours at a time. He thought about working on some of his schoolwork, but mostly spent the time just laying in his bed looking at the ceiling. The attack had caused him to change his entire worldview. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 thought he was going to die and the heroes did nothing about it. They all sat back and watched, making a spectacle of his pain. He remembered the humiliation he felt, his own tears burning his skin as he fought to breathe. But one person had actually come to help him, and his savior was someone he wished he would never have to see again. Deku, Midoriya Izuku, the kid he had ridiculed and bullied, making him feel the same way 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 probably did. The only person to step up even though he made his life a living hell. How he told him to kill himself just earlier that day. And 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 hated how that made him feel. He hated the guilt that ate through him like a pit in his stomach. He didn't deserve to feel guilt after all he had done. His spiraling thoughts caused frustrated tears to spill from his eyes. He forced his palms into his eyes, trying to stop himself from crying. As it proved to be inefficient, he screamed and threw the pillow he was lying on at the wall. He watched as the pillow hit one of his All Might posters and fell to the floor with a thump. The All Might poster. It had been one he and Deku got together when they were younger. He wondered if he still had the same poster, but pushed the thought out of his head. They had both met their idol on the same day. While Deku had been the one to help him in the first place, All Might was the one who actually freed him from the attack. He would never let anyone know, but he had overheard the conversation Deku had with All Might. He had heard the soul-crushing words come from the hero's mouth and hit their mark. And 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 agreed. Deku couldn't be a hero. He was quirkless and would only end up dead. And as much as he made threats, he didn't want to see Deku dead. The thought of the nerd laying pale in a casket while Auntie and Co wept over him made his stomach churn. The guilt he was feeling now would only increase tenfold. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 wasn't even sure why he had started bullying him in the first place. Maybe it was because of his status as a quirkless kid, and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 didn't want to associate himself with that. He was afraid that the nerd would only bring him down in the process, and in a way, he had. Maybe it was because he felt threatened. They both had dreams to become heroes when they were older, but one got a quirk and the other didn't. And no matter what came his way, Deku always had a positive outlook on things. He was a kind soul, his mother would say, and that is what draws people to them. He was afraid he would somehow get outshined, and Deku would end up the one on top. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 couldn't have that, so he ended up turning everyone against him in one way or another. Once the others saw that his best friend was bullying him, they saw it as a pass to do the same. And as much as 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 wanted to go back in time and scream at his younger self, tell himself how much of a selfish dick he was, he would never be able to do that. Now he had to live with the consequences of his own actions. At this rate he would never be a hero. He should just give up before he has the chance to ruin someone else's life. What kind of hero would hurt those that cared about them? Pull others down into the pit he dug himself, using them as a stepping stool to get himself free. No good hero would do that. That wasn't what All Might projected. He was one who had shown kindness and security to those who needed it. Just as he flopped back down on his bed, he heard a shout from the kitchen. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬, get out here. It's time for dinner. He only groaned, trying to massage an incoming headache. Shut the fuck up, he screamed back. He wasn't ready to face his parents while he looked like this. Don't speak to your mother that way. A more timid voice called out, but 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 didn't bother giving him a response. He just continued to stare at the ceiling, ignoring any talk from outside his room. This was his grave and he was going to rot in it. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 woke the next morning with bleary eyes. His stomach growled as he realized he fell asleep before he had the chance to actually go and grab dinner. He looked over at his alarm clock, realizing that he was a whole 30 minutes early, and he was going to make good use of his time. He took a quick shower, getting himself ready for the day. Once he got himself fully ready, he walked to the living room to get some downtime before he walked to school. Instead, he found his father sitting on the sofa and sipping his coffee. He turned to look at the blonde as he entered the room. Good morning, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬. Did you sleep well? 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 only huffed in response, flopping down onto the couch next to him and kicking his feet onto the coffee table. His father pushed his legs off. You know your mother wouldn't like that. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 ignored him, but didn't make a move to put his feet on the table again. 𝐻𝐻, we've been worried about you. Why don't you tell us what is going on? His father pleaded, but 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 turned away. He didn't want his father to see the tears staining his eyes. Whatever, I'm fine, he shot back, pushing himself off the couch. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 decided that he needed an early walk. By the time school started, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 had been there for at most 30 minutes. He managed to get there at a time when some teachers were able to let him into the building. He stalked directly to his homeroom class, shoving his bag to the floor and sitting himself in his chair. He propped his head on the desk and shut his eyes. He wasn't able to sleep, but he left himself to his thoughts. His mind swirled as the steady sound of footsteps trailed in and out of the classroom. Even with his rapidly degrading hearing, he could recognize each pair of footsteps as they entered the classroom. There's Tsubasa, Tetsuya, and Hamacho. Then the teacher, Mr. Kadoku. There were some unknown ones, but he figured they were friends of those in this homeroom. By the time that class started, there was someone that he could not hear. Deku, while 𝐀𝐦 noticed that the boy had been much more quiet recently. It was still weird not being there at all. Said boy hadn't been present very much the past few weeks, and 𝐀𝐦 wouldn't say he was worried, but it was something that caught his eye. He lifted his head as the teacher called the class to attention. The empty space behind him was loud, but no one else seemed to notice. It made 𝐀𝐦 much more on edge than he had been. Minutes ticked by, still no appearance. But 𝐀𝐦 thought that Deku had every right to not show up to school. With how he and others had treated him, 𝐀𝐦 wouldn't blame him. They were well into the class when Deku finally showed up. He rushed into the room, heavily breathing as he silently made his way to his desk. 𝐀𝐦 let out a sigh of relief. But even with him there, it was still weirdly quiet. He resisted the urge to turn himself around, because he began to wonder if he had imagined the nerd actually entering the classroom. But out of the corner of his eyes, he could see some people across the classroom pointing and snickering to a spot behind 𝐀𝐦, so he figured he wasn't being delusional. Hearing the faint chicken scratch of Deku's pencil reassured him. He found it hard to focus during the entirety of the class period, his mind preoccupied with every thought that he had in the past month. Should I thank him? Interrogate him? Why did he save me? After all I've done, I definitely didn't deserve it. But thinking back, 𝐀𝐦 realized why he must have done it. It's something he's known his entire life. Deku was someone with a kind spirit. He would run in to help anyone if they needed it. And while 𝐀𝐦 always aspired to be a hero, Deku had the hero's spirit. He would step in no matter what it cost him. And that scared 𝐀𝐦, because if he bullied and harmed the perfect hero, wouldn't that make him the villain? And if he continued, he would never make it down the path of redemption. These thoughts had plagued him since the attack, making him reconsider all he had ever thought and done. He couldn't just apologize, could he? He would need to make a bigger gesture of peace if he wanted that done. But he didn't want to embarrass himself, doing that in front of the whole school. 𝐀𝐦 had also gone to avoid directly involving himself in the bullying. But it didn't really make anything better. People kept giving him weird looks when he would ignore them or the confrontation in general, so they amped it up instead. His old friends stopped hanging around him too, as he had gotten into a habit of snapping at them. And not in his normal way. He was snapped out of his thoughts by the lunch bell ringing. The rest of his class was packing up their bags and getting out of their seats as 𝐀𝐦 started putting his stuff away. He noticed a small group of girls snickering and walking over to him and Deku, but he shot them a glare. They responded with a disgusted face, but backed off, heading out to lunch. As soon as they left, Deku rushed past him into the door, without a single look in his direction. 𝐀𝐦 had spent the rest of the school day watching Deku, acting like the stalker that he accused the other of being. It was a bit harder when the nerd's social habit was to disappear for big gaps of time. He tried not to make it obvious, but no one paid attention to him anymore anyway. After the final bell had rung, 𝐀𝐦 stopped Deku before he got up to leave. "Hey, nerd, I've got something I want to talk to you about." Deku blinked owlishly, eyes quickly looking over to the group looming in the corner, seemingly waiting for 𝐀𝐦 to drag him out so they could join in. 𝐀𝐦 caught his eye and turned towards the others. "Scram," he spat, glaring daggers into the group. They stumbled a bit, not expecting the outburst, looking towards each other in confusion before slowly leaving the room. Turning back, he saw Deku looking at him quizzically, possibly wondering if someone else had taken the place of 𝐀𝐦. "Boy, stop fucking looking at me like that. I'm the real me." Deku looked around the room again, only finding it empty other than them. "Okay, what do you want?" The nerd shot him a look with a sharpness 𝐀𝐦 hadn't seen before. He faltered for a second before starting. "Where the fuck have you been? You've barely been in school, and even when you are here you're so quiet. I know Auntie and Co wouldn't let you just skip. And you used to care so much about school. So much has changed with you since that attack." 𝐀𝐦 stopped, breathing heavily to try and catch his breath. Deku just stared at him, face going slack. "You know, I could say the same about you. Don't think I haven't noticed how quiet you've been. Feeling a sense of pity now? Huh." 𝐀𝐦 balked. This wasn't the Deku he knew. This had to be a mistake. "Hey, I've stopped beating you up. And in all that other stuff." He scrambled to find his foothold in the conversation, keeping himself from slipping into insanity. Something wasn't right. "Just because you've backed off doesn't mean everyone else has." Deku took a step forward, green eyes locking with 𝐀𝐦's red. "You've only become a bystander, Bakugo. And that is no better than you were before." And with that he grabbed his bag and left the classroom, leaving 𝐀𝐦 alone and reeling. Bakugo, Bakugo, Bakugo. That's what he had called him. Just one word had 𝐀𝐦 spiraling. He had to keep telling that Deku was real, and not some figment of his guilty imagination or a doppelganger. But he deserved it, really. Deku wasn't the same person he was before. He had grown. And 𝐀𝐦 didn't. He still resorted to petty elementary school drama and tricks, but they had grown up. 𝐀𝐦 didn't want to become a villain. He didn't want to end up like his classmates in the path he saw them going on. But he didn't know how to stop himself. There was a knock on his bedroom door as Katsuki was in one of his episodes. He didn't look away from his ceiling, laying flat on his back. "Go away," he yelled, but he knew it was no use. The door opened and his mother stepped in. "Katsuki, that is no way to speak to your mother." She walked over and sat on the corner of his bed. "This isn't healthy for you, Kats, and I think you know it too." Katsuki finally spared a glance at Mitsuki, her eyes full of concern. "Matsuru and I had a proposition. You haven't been doing well, and you won't talk to us about it." She started, and Katsuki raised an eyebrow. "We would like you to consider getting a therapist," she finished. Katsuki shot up. "I'm not fucking weak. I don't need help," he growled. Mitsuki sighed. "I'm not saying you're weak, Kats, and everyone needs a little help. You've gone through a traumatic experience at such a young age. It only makes sense." He knew his mother was an unstoppable force, and he figured that was the same here. He sighed. "Fine," and Mitsuki's face grew into a victorious grin.